Welcome, fellow travelers, curious minds, to our journey through the currents of time. Tonight, and perhaps for nights to come, we will not merely skim the dry pages of history. Instead, we shall endeavor to feel, to breathe, to live alongside the echoes of ages and lives long past. Let us, for a moment, set aside our modern world, with its glaring screens and its symphony of engines. Let your imagination be your guide. Let the shadows lengthen, and listen to the resonant call of what has been. For history is not just dates and decrees. It is the pulse of humanity, its triumphs, its sorrows, its stories yearning to be retold. And for our first tale, I invite you to brace yourselves, to step bravely into a realm perhaps starkly different from any you've ever envisioned. Story 1. The unvarnished truth of medieval life, beyond castles and chivalry. All right, everyone, let's step together through a rather different kind of portal. Not one leading to the glittering castles or a tale of gallant knights that Hollywood so loves to portray. Tonight, we peel back a darker, grittier layer of history, a chapter you probably wouldn't wish to linger in for more than a single day. Take a deep breath, for the air we're about to inhale is far from the clean, crisp air you know. Dim those lights, let the shadows lengthen, and listen closely to the whispers of a bygone era, an age known as the Middle Ages. Are you truly prepared to face its unvarnished truth? Congratulations, you just blinked your eyes open to the year 1325. The good news? You're breathing. The bad news? So are the fleas, and they're likely feasting. That bed you've just risen from? Forget memory foam or soft Egyptian cotton. Imagine, if you will, a half-rotted straw mattress, teeming with unseen, scurrying life, and hay that reeks with the pungent aroma of a barn floor. Because, well, 3 months ago, it was a barn floor. No pillows offer comfort, no pristine sheets. Just a coarse woolen blanket, unwashed since last winter, now stiff and heavy as a small calf with accumulated grime and who knows what else. You try to shake off the dregs of sleep as a distant, metallic clang. Clang, clang, pierces the morning air. That, my friend, is your medieval alarm clock. Only it's far louder and infinitely less merciful than any you've known. Your home, if you can call it that, is a single-room wooden hut. No windows to speak of, just gaps in the timber, and a charmingly open-concept floor plan where your family, your livestock, yes, the goat is your roommate, and a lively population of domestic insects all share the same cramped, earthy space. And the smell? Oh, the smell. It's a fragrant symphony, isn't it? A subtle, pervasive blend of stale beer, human sweat still clinging to the air from the night, the sharp tang of goat, and something you desperately pray isn't mold, but deep in your soul, you know it probably is. Scented candles? They haven't been invented. And even if they had, they'd likely just melt into a useless puddle on your bare dirt floor. You attempt to stretch, a simple morning ritual, but immediately regret it. The air is biting, freezing cold, and your joints, they ache with a weariness that belies your age. You're 22. In medieval terms, that's practically middle-aged. Your spine creaks like an old, unhinged wooden door, and your knees? They sound like a bag of rocks being vigorously shaken by a very confused and rather clumsy peasant. Just getting out of that dubious bed is a gamble. Will the floor be sodden and slick from last night's rain, which, of course, leaked generously through the thatched roof? Or will it be crusty and uneven from something your neighbor's chicken might have deposited during an unauthorized visit? Either way, your bare feet are now intimately acquainted with the local ecosystem. And privacy? What's that curious word? Your entire family, perhaps including a random cousin who arrived 3 years ago and simply never left, are all stirring beside you, around you. There are no bedrooms as you know them, no curtains to draw, no concept of me time. It's communal everything, all the time. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never truly alone because parasites, rodents, and at least 8 other people are always with you. And this, my friend, is just how your day starts. Believe me, It only gets worse from here. So, you've somehow managed to crawl out of your medieval haystack of horrors. A small victory, congratulations. Now nature calls, and it's not calling politely. It's bellowing, demanding attention. Ah, here's the part where you'll truly, deeply start missing the pristine porcelain of a modern bathroom. There's no toilet, no comfortable seat, certainly no toilet paper, no convenient flush, not even a mildly resentful plunger tucked away in the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an adventure, a social experiment, and often a rather public event. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is likely a simple wooden bucket, perhaps nestled discreetly, or not so discreetly, behind the house. A bucket that is, more often than not, already brimming because Uncle Wolfstan had a rather rough night after indulging in some questionable turnips. The stench? It's biblical. You hold your breath, do your business, and then, here's the kicker. You toss it. Where? Into the street. Yes, the street. If you're feeling considerate, you're supposed to shout something like, "Gare-de-lou," before you unceremoniously dump the contents from your window or doorway. That's Old French for "watch out below." Though frankly, given the state of things, no one ever seems to move quite fast enough. Medieval town streets are essentially open sewers, a charming, bubbling river of human waste, animal droppings, and various mystery liquids you'd rather not examine too closely. Now, if you're fortunate enough to live in a town boasting public latrines, well, congratulations. You get the distinct pleasure of sitting shoulder to shoulder with complete strangers in an outhouse, where privacy is a laughable myth and ventilation is a cruel, forgotten joke. You might even make some small talk, but try not to breathe too deeply. And toilet paper? Never heard of it. Most people make do with straw, leaves, rags, a handful of moss, or if they're feeling particularly indulgent, a scrap of rough wool. Sometimes nothing at all, which might just explain why handshakes weren't quite the popular greeting back then. But surely, you might think, if you're in a castle, it's better, right? Well, sort of. You might have access to a garderobe, essentially a hole in the castle wall that drops your waist directly into the moat below. A great idea in theory, except your enemies, astute as they are, also know this. And yes, attackers have, on occasion, climbed in through the waist chute. Talk about an unwelcome entry through the back door. So, whether you're a humble farmer or a lofty baron, medieval toileting is a daily ritual of humiliation. It's cold, it's public, it's often dangerous, and it's never, ever not disgusting. One slip on a wet, greasy stone path, and you're face first in humanity's collective leftovers, and you still haven't brushed your teeth. But don't worry, we'll get to that horror next. You've survived the ordeal of the medieval toilet. You surely deserve a reward, right? Perhaps a nice, hearty breakfast? Something warm, delicious, comforting to start the day? I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is medieval Europe. Nothing is truly comforting here, especially not the food. Breakfast, if you can even dignify it with that name, is a grim, uninspiring affair. There are no eggs Benedict sizzling, no coffee machine sputtering to life, and certainly no avocado toast. You sit down, or more likely squat, near the sputtering fire to a wooden bowl filled with something that looks suspiciously like it was scraped off a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily ration of pottage. What is pottage, you ask? It's a thick, gloopy, often bland stew made from whatever grains, root vegetables, and perhaps a few lonely beans could be scrounged up. It's likely been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes even weeks, with new ingredients simply dumped on top of the old. It's less of a recipe and more of an ongoing, edible science experiment. On the side, you'll find a hunk of bread so hard it could probably deflect an arrow. This isn't your fluffy, artisanal loaf. It's made from coarse rye or barley flour, often bulked up with sawdust, ground up acorns, or other creative fillers because wheat is a rich man's fantasy. This loaf is not your friend. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it, often with a dull knife and a prayer. And what about drinks? You're certainly not sipping on fresh orange juice or a creamy oat milk latte. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer. At 6 a.m. Why? You wonder, with a dawning sense of dread. Because the water, The readily available water from the local stream or well is teeming with parasites, bacteria, and all manner of filth. So you start your day with small ale, low in alcohol, but high in survivability. Even the children drink it. No one's particularly thrilled about it, but at least it's less likely to kill you immediately than the water. Want some meat or cheese? Dream on. That's reserved for Sundays, saints' feast days, and only then if your local lord is feeling particularly generous. Most peasants don't see meat more than a few precious times a year. As for fresh fruit, it's a rare treat, only available when in season and not already fermented into some potent wine. And don't even think about spices, unless you're royalty. A tiny pinch of pepper could cost more than your monthly wages. Salt is so valuable, it's often locked away. So, you chew your gritty, unyielding bread, gulp down your medieval beer, and try very hard not to think about the rat that may, or may not, have nibbled on your pottage during the night. Breakfast doesn't energize you. It just happens to you. And now that you're suitably underfed and vaguely inebriated, it's time to work like your life depends on it. Because, make no mistake, it absolutely does. So, you've heroically consumed your sad medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll significantly improve your situation, mind you. Your wardrobe, in all its glory, consists of precisely one outfit. One, it's a rough, scratchy woolen tunic or perhaps a linen shift that you've worn day in and day out for months, possibly years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. There's just wear this until it literally disintegrates or give you a rather aggressive fungal infection. Underwear, optional and often absent. If you're lucky, maybe a linen undertunic. If you're not so fortunate, well, you're going commando under layers of itchy, sweaty wool, all lovingly stitched together by someone who probably had no clear idea what a proper scene was supposed to look like. There's also no washing machine, no fragrant soap, and absolutely no dry cleaner in sight. So, your clothes are invariably stained, stiff with grime, and scented like a compost pile that's been left to marinate in a pigsty during a heat wave. Even if you wanted to wash them, it's no simple task. You'd have to haul water, likely heavy bucket by heavy bucket, from a distant river or well. Then, you need to heat it over an open fire, a precious use of fuel. Then, you'd scrub your solitary tunic on a rough board, perhaps with some ashes or lye as a rudimentary detergent. And finally, hang it in the sun to dry, a sun which, in many parts of Europe, makes an appearance approximately 3 days a year. And don't even get me started on shoes. If you own any, and that's a big if for many, they're made of untreated leather, barely stitched together, and offer about as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants simply go barefoot, through mud, through dung, through a delightful array of medieval landmines, otherwise known as sharp rocks and disease-ridden puddles. All of this means one thing. Your skin absolutely hates you. You itch, constantly. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs live rent-free on your body, in your clothes, in your hair. Everyone has them. Nobles are lousy, monks are itchy, and children are basically walking insect farms. No one escapes. You'll find yourself scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while attempting a polite conversation with the local priest, and no one will even bat an eyelid. It's just normal. Your skin is raw from rubbing. Your scalp is a veritable battlefield of bites. And if you develop a rash, well, too bad. There's no dermatologist, no soothing hydrocortisone cream, no one to gently inform you that it's probably scabies. You just keep on suffering. And if by some small miracle it doesn't get infected, great. That rash will simply accompany you for the next 6 months, like an unwanted, itchy medieval sidekick. Now that you're thoroughly dressed in misery and wrapped in perpetual discomfort, it's time to head outside and start working yourself, quite literally, to death. Now that you're fully dressed in itches and damp, unyielding wool, it's time to flash that radiant morning smile. Except you don't. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a dangerous game. Not emotionally, mind you, but dentally. The concept of oral hygiene is about as popular as, say, regular bathing, which is to say not very popular at all. There's no toothbrush as we know it, no mini toothpaste, no refreshing mouthwash, and certainly no floss. Some people might occasionally chew on a twig to try and dislodge food, or rinse their mouths with wine or vinegar if they had it. But for the most part, your teeth are left to fend for themselves. And trust me, they are not doing well. By the time you hit your mid-20s, assuming you've made it that far, your smile probably looks like something unearthed from a haunted crypt. Cavities are rampant, a common affliction. Gums are often swollen, red, and bleeding. And those aren't just stubborn food stains on your teeth. That, my friend, is decay actively eating away at your enamel. You likely have more rot in your mouth than a medieval root cellar after a particularly damp winter. Sugar, while not yet the ubiquitous menace it is today, is becoming more common, especially among the wealthy. It's imported at great cost, mostly used in small, precious cakes, or as a way for the rich to ostentatiously show off their rapidly decaying teeth. So, if you're a noble, congratulations. You get to rot your teeth even faster than the peasants. If you're poor, you'll still achieve significant decay, just perhaps a bit more slowly, fueled by a diet of fermented bread, gritty porridge, and years of hard, relentless chewing. Toothaches? Oh, you'll get used to them. They're like the medieval weather, always there, a dull, throbbing background noise to your existence. The kind of persistent, agonizing pain that makes you seriously consider praying to every saint you know, drinking yourself into oblivion, or perhaps even attempting to pull the offending tooth out yourself with a pair of rusty pliers. And that's not a joke. That often was the actual treatment. Dentists, as specialized professionals, didn't really exist. But barber surgeons did. Yes, the same friendly fellow who cuts your hair, or more accurately, hacks at it, is also the one yanking out your molars, probably by flickering candlelight, using an unsterilized iron hook and offering precisely zero anesthesia. Got an infected tooth? Hope you like fevers, chills, and the very real possibility of sepsis. Because without antibiotics, a simple toothache can easily turn into a fatal infection. That's right, the same minor inconvenience that sends us to a pharmacy for some painkillers today could very well be your funeral in the 1300s. And there's no relief on the social front either. Kissing? Good luck with that. Halitosis, or, to put it bluntly, horrendously bad breath, is absolutely everywhere. If you're single and looking to marry, you're not judged by your dazzling smile. You're judged by your land, your livestock, and your ability to produce heirs. In short, your mouth is a constant, losing battlefield. And now that your teeth are throbbing in sympathetic agony, let's head outside. Because your real job, the one that will inevitably break your back and grind you down, is just getting started. Time to head to work. Except there's no air-conditioned office, no ergonomic desk, no scheduled coffee break, and absolutely, positively no chance of promotion. Your job, if you're like roughly 90% of the population, is brutally simple. Don't die while laboring relentlessly for someone else's comfort and profit. You're a peasant. Congratulations. That means you work the land, endless acres of it, land that belongs to a lord who probably doesn't even remember your name, let alone care about your well-being. You rise with the sun, or more accurately, with that infernal church bell, and you stop working only when the sun finally dips below the trees, plunging the world into a cold, weary darkness. Your tools? Perhaps a crudely fashioned wooden hoe, a rusty sickle that's seen better centuries, and whatever bones are still reasonably intact in your aching body. There's no concept of a weekend as we know it. There's no clocking out at 5. There's only sunrise to sunset, 6 grueling days a week. Sunday is technically a day off, a day for God, but only if you're not desperately trying to get the harvest in before it rots, or fighting off a band of opportunistic raiders, or perhaps praying feverishly in the drafty church for your infected toe to please stop turning an alarming shade of black. The work itself is brutal, back-breaking, and mind-numbingly repetitive. Fields are plowed by hand, or if your lord is particularly wealthy, meaning he owns more than one pair of shoes, perhaps with a team of weary oxen. You dig ditches until your hands are raw and blistered. You sow seeds, stooping for hours under a merciless sun or a chilling rain. You pull weeds, an endless, thankless task. You carry water, heavy, sloshing buckets of it, until your spine begins to permanently resemble the letter S. No one cares if you're tired. No one's asking about your mental health or your general state of despair. If you're a woman, surprise. You don't just do the exhausting field work alongside the men. You also bear and care for the children, many of whom won't survive childhood. You clean the squalid hut. You cook the meager meals. You spin wool in a thread. You feed the few animals you might own, and you try to pray. And your husband's ever-present lice infestation isn't slowly, but surely, migrating to your side of the straw bed. And the children? They start helping out, which means working, around the tender age of 5. There's no school, no brightly colored toys, just a tiny wooden rake and a desperate, unspoken dream of one day not dying of the flu before you see 20. And what if you're one of the few who isn't a farmer? Perhaps you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or cooper. Great! You still work with searing fire, corrosive chemicals, or rank animal guts all day long in poorly ventilated sheds that are either freezing in winter or sweltering in summer. The pay for all this toil? Basically, survival rations. The perks? The occasional opportunity to bleed profusely. Break a bone? Too bad. Get a raging fever? Drink some warm beer, say a prayer, and keep going. You simply can't afford to stop, not even for a single day. Because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a rather efficient solution for that. It's called being replaced. So, you grip your shovel a little tighter, ignore the stinging blisters on your palms, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career path. It's a slow-motion endurance test, a daily battle against exhaustion and despair. Now that your back is screaming in agony from laboring in the fields from dawn till dusk, let's talk about something equally delightful, the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature isn't just about seasons. It's more like an ongoing, relentless punishment delivered directly from the sky. Let's start with winter. Imagine this. There's no insulation in your flimsy wooden hut, no central heating, no double-glazed windows, no weather stripping. Just wooden walls with gaps, so wide you could probably throw a chicken through them. Your windows, if you have them, are likely just openings covered with a piece of grease cloth or a wooden shutter, neither of which does much to keep out the bitter, biting cold. The fire in the hearth? Nice in theory, a flickering beacon of hope, but you rarely have enough firewood to keep it roaring. Wood is expensive, and gathering it from the Lord's forest is often illegal. Yes, you could literally be executed or maimed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong patch of woodland. So, you bundle up in your one damp, scratchy wool tunic, you huddle pathetically near the dying embers of the fire, and you still wake up with your nose feeling like an icicle and your breath misting in the frigid air inside your home. Your feet are permanently cold, often damp from the seeping ground or a leaky roof, and your fingers become so stiff they feel like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite isn't diagnosed with any medical precision. It's just called bad luck or God's will. Now, let's fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? A respite from a cold? Wrong. In summer, your charming one-room hovel transforms into a stifling clay oven. There's no electric fan, no refreshing cross breeze from an open window, because you don't really have effective windows, and absolutely, categorically no deodorant. You sweat profusely through your single layer of wool, but you can't simply remove it, because showing too much skin is scandalous, ungodly, and also practically invites sunburn, a swarm of insect bites, and harsh social judgment. The flies are out in full, buzzing force, attracted to your unwashed body, the general filth, and the lingering smell of last week's goat stew that's still gently fermenting in a forgotten corner. Mosquitoes whine incessantly by your ear while you try to sleep, assuming you can sleep through the cacophony of your neighbors yelling, babies crying, and dogs barking. Out in the fields, the sun bakes you relentlessly. There's no sunblock, no wide-brimmed hat unless you've cleverly fashioned one out of straw, looking like a desperate, overworked scarecrow. And the worst part? You still have to work from sunup to sundown. Heat stroke isn't a recognized medical condition. It's just called taking a bad turn or being struck by the sun. So, you're either shivering uncontrollably in your own hovel, wondering if your toes will actually make it to spring, where you're sweating through your only pair of socks if you have them, while your thighs chafe into a raw, painful oblivion. And the one thing that never, ever changes, no matter the season, your clothes still itch, your food is still terrible, and your next grueling task is always, always waiting. Welcome to climate control, medieval style. Spoiler, there is none. Feeling a bit parched after all that talk of toil and temperature? Need to freshen up? Want to splash a little cool water on your face to wake up from this damp, fever dream of a life? Too bad. In medieval times, water isn't your friendly, life-sustaining companion. More often than not, it's actively trying to murder you, quietly and insidiously. Let's start with drinking water. The nearby stream might look picturesque, doesn't it? Bubbling and clear, like something out of a fantasy novel. But spoiler alert, it's not. Just a little way upstream, someone has almost certainly just dumped the contents of their chamber pot into it. And if not that, then a dead pig or some other rotting carcass is probably gently decomposing in it, leaching all sorts of unpleasantness into the current. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe are eagerly awaiting their chance in every single sip. That's precisely why people drank beer. Yes, beer, even to children. But before you start imagining medieval toddlers doing keg stands, understand that this was small beer, very weak in alcohol, but crucially strong in its chances of not giving you a fatal illness. The brewing process, you see, involved boiling the water, which inadvertently killed off many of code's dangerous pathogens. So, it was significantly safer than whatever dubious liquid flowed through the town ditch or was drawn from the communal well. Wine was another option, if you were wealthy enough to afford it, and perhaps unconcerned with functioning with any degree of sobriety before noon. What about bathing? Surely water was used for cleaning oneself? Well, in theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not as much as you'd think or hope. See, back in those enlightened times, many people genuinely believed that bathing, particularly in hot water, actually opened your pores and let the sickness or bad humors in. That's right. Washing yourself thoroughly was often considered medically risky. You were apparently cleaner, or at least better protected, if you never removed the protective layer of grime, sweat, and filth that was caked onto your skin. Communal bathhouses did exist in some towns, but they quickly gained rather sordid reputations as places for gossip, scandal, and sometimes full-on medieval extracurricular activities. So, naturally, the church, ever vigilant, got involved and eventually shut many of them down. Even if you did want to take a proper bath, it was a full-scale production. You'd need to fetch the water, an arduous task in itself. Then you'd have to boil it over a precious fire, find a large wooden tub, which probably leaked, fill it, and then pray no one else in the household used it before you, or worse, after you without changing the water. And rainwater? Often collected in open barrels where birds would happily poop, insects would breed, and a lovely layer of moss would thrive. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So, whether it's going in your mouth, on your body, or onto your meager crops, water in the Middle Ages is less of a life source and more of a daily gamble. One wrong gulp, one ill-advised splash, and you could be spending your final, agonizing days sweating in a straw bed, clutching your stomach, and contemplating all your unfortunate life choices. Next time you casually sip clean, safe tap water, perhaps raise a silent glass to our ancestors. They certainly didn't have the luxury of hydration without hazard. So, you drank the questionable water. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like acute disappointment. Either way, you're sick. You feel awful. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is often indistinguishable from polite, or not so polite, torture, occasionally administered by someone with a rudimentary theology degree. Let's start with the diagnosis. Everything, and I mean everything, wrong with you, whether it's a cough, a persistent rash, a broken bone, or the creeping, dreaded plague, is almost certainly caused by your humors being out of balance. What are these humors, you ask? According to medieval science, your body contains 4 of them: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your health, apparently, depends on keeping these four liquids in perfect, harmonious balance, like some sort of delicate internal soup. Got a fever? Clearly, you have too much blood. The obvious answer? Bloodletting. That's right. Let's just drain a significant portion of your life force into a bowl, using either a not very sharp blade or a collection of hungry, writhing leeches. And yes, as we mentioned, barbers were often the ones performing this delicate procedure. Imagine going in for a quick trim and a light hemoglobin extraction in one convenient sitting. 2 for 1, baby. Feeling sad, melancholic, or anxious? That's clearly an excess of black bile. The cure? Potent laxatives, perhaps a warm herbal purge designed to empty your bowels with alarming efficiency, or maybe just some fervent prayers and a cold compress while everyone in the room studiously avoids eye contact with you and subtly starts carving your coffin, just in case. Now, if you break a bone or get a nasty, gaping wound, you're in real trouble. There's no effective anesthesia, unless you count passing out from sheer, unadulterated pain. Surgery, if attempted, is often done with knives and saws that haven't been properly cleaned since the Crusades. Surgical tools might be heated over a fire, not primarily for sterilization, a concept still centuries away, but mostly because they just look scarier and more impressive that way. Antibiotics? Not for another few hundred years. Germ theory? Not even a glimmer on the horizon. They genuinely believe disease comes from bad air, miasma, or more commonly, from God being particularly annoyed with your moral failings or sinful thoughts. Got a persistent stomach ache? Must have been those impure thoughts you had last Tuesday. Hope you enjoy confessing your sins while simultaneously vomiting into a wooden bucket. If your condition worsens, which it probably will, you'll likely be treated with more leeches, possibly some crushed beetles mixed into a poultice, and a stern-faced priest at your bedside, already administering the last rites, just to be on the safe side. At this point, they're basically preparing for the ultimate cure, the one known as death. And if, by some astonishing miracle, you actually recover, everyone just assumes God took pity on you. The doctor or barber or local wise woman takes full credit naturally, and the leech probably gets a promotion. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine is less about actual healing and far more about surviving the cure itself. After a long, grueling day of back-breaking labor, relentless lice, and dubious leeches, it's finally time to eat again. You shuffle wearily back to your hovel, your stomach growling with a hollow ache, ready, perhaps, for the one small joy left in your wretched life, a warm, or at least vaguely edible meal. Bad news. Your meal is probably, once again, trying to kill you. Let's begin with the basics. Food preservation, as we understand it, doesn't really exist. There's no refrigerator, no convenient freezer, just salt, if you're lucky and can afford it, smoke, or the increasingly faint hope that the winter air will keep things from turning completely putrid. Your meat, if you're fortunate enough to have any, has likely been hanging for days, possibly weeks, covered in a buzzing cloud of flies, perhaps marinated in some questionable brine, and almost certainly shared with a rat or two who consider it their personal larder. Bread, as we've established, is the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but even that isn't always safe. In bad harvest years, which are frequent, desperate peasants will bulk up their meager bread dough with anything they can find, tree bark, sawdust, even clay, just to make it stretch a little further, to fill their bellies with something, anything. And if it's rice season, there's a delightful bonus, ergot. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on rye, and ingesting it can cause convulsions, terrifying hallucinations, gangrene, and sometimes a rather unpleasant death. It's like eating bread generously laced with LSD and tetanus, all in one. Vegetables? Only if they're in season, and you know what's always in season, or at least always available in some preserved, joyless form? Turnips. So many. Turnips. Boiled, mashed, or sadly floating in that perpetual pottage which, if you recall from our earlier delightful culinary journey, is basically a hot, bubbling swamp of mystery ingredients that's been simmering gently since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might be a fleeting pleasure in the autumn, but it rots quickly, and sugar, as we know, is a rare, expensive luxury, hoarded by the rich primarily to show off their impressively blackened and decaying teeth. Dairy is another gamble. Fresh milk spoils within hours in the absence of refrigeration. Butter and cheese fare a little better, but they're often loaded with bacteria. People eat them anyway, because frankly, it's either that or attempting to chew your own boot leather for sustenance. And let's talk about seasoning or the distinct lack thereof. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg. They are literally worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes primarily from onions, if you have them, salt, if you're incredibly lucky, and the dull, aching throb of chronic pain. Most meals, if we're being honest, taste like wet burlap sprinkled with profound sadness. But food isn't just a health hazard in the Middle Ages. It's a political one, too. Those deer in the forest, the rabbits darting through the undergrowth, the fish in the river, they belong to the Lord, not to you. If you're caught poaching a rabbit to feed your starving family, you could be heavily fined, imprisoned, lose a hand, or even be executed. That's right, your desperate attempt to find dinner could get you hanged. So, as you sit down to eat your gray, unappetizing stew by the flickering, smoky light of a tallow candle or the dying embers of a hearth, remember, every single bite is a risk. But you eat it anyway, because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't so much nourish you, it tests you. It challenges your will to live. It's evening now. You've worked until your muscles have turned to fire. You've suffered the indignities of medieval hygiene, or lack thereof, and you've barely digested your suspicious, potentially lethal stew. You might think, with a sigh of relief, that the day is finally winding down. But don't get too relaxed, because God is watching. So is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely, positively rat you out to the authorities if you dare miss Massachusetts. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just a part of life. It is life interwoven into every fiber of your existence. The church controls your calendar, your laws, your education. If you're one of the microscopic percentage who can actually read, your birth, your marriage, your death, and pretty much everything in between. Think of it as your omnipresent spiritual landlord. And you, my friend, are always perpetually behind on the rent. Every day is structured around the relentless call of prayer bells. The town church bell rings in the morning, at noon, and in the evening, not just because people need gentle reminders, but because missing prayer or even appearing insufficiently devout is a sin. And sin has consequences. Forget to bow your head at the appropriate moment? Sin. Eat meat on a Friday when you're not supposed to? Sin. Think about your neighbor's wife in that one rather vivid dream you had. Double sin, and you'd better confess it quickly. And yes, hell is very, very real. Vividly, terrifyingly real. Priests describe it in glorious, horrifying detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons armed with pitchforks and sadistic grins, and the sound of eternal, agonizing wailing. If the ever-present threat of the plague doesn't scare you into obedience, the prospect of eternal damnation most certainly will. You can't read the Bible yourself, of course. It's written in Latin, a lofty language reserved for monks, clergy, and that one exceptionally privileged, noble kid who's clearly too good for dirt and honest labor. You rely entirely on the church, on your local priest, to interpret everything for you, God's will, the meaning of life, why your crops failed again this year. And that means if the priest says your crop failure is because you didn't pray hard enough, or because you harbored sinful thoughts, well, then it's time to get on your knees and pray harder with more groveling. Tithes, a tenth of everything you own or produce, are mandatory, non-negotiable. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you raise chickens, you give eggs. If you have absolutely nothing to your name, congratulations. You're spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed, a truly winning combination. Holidays? They're holy days, and there are dozens of them. And while they might offer a brief break from the back-breaking labor of the fields, they're not for fun and frivolous enjoyment. Oh no, they are for attending Mass, often for many hours, for fasting, for confessing your endless sins, and for reminding yourself that joy, especially worldly joy, is a dangerous, suspicious indulgence that probably leads straight to perdition. Questioning the church, even in the privacy of your own mind, is incredibly dangerous. Heretics are burned at the stake. Those accused of witchcraft, often women who are merely knowledgeable about herbs or simply didn't conform, are drowned or hanged. Blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are very quickly and often painfully reformed. So, you go through the motions. You chant the Latin phrases you don't understand. You bow when you're told to bow. You pray desperately that your soul, after enduring this dirt-covered, lice-ridden, pain-filled life, might finally land in paradise, assuming, of course, that the priest likes you and puts in a good word. Because in the Middle Ages, God may, in theory, be merciful, but the church? Not so much. If you thought being a medieval peasant was a rough, unrewarding gig, now try doing it as a woman. Imagine all the filth, the famine, the fear, and the feudal oppression, and then add on top of that childbirth without medical aid, complete subservience to men, and a profound social invisibility. In the Middle Ages, being born a woman is like playing life on the hardest possible difficulty setting, with no health potions, no extra lives, and absolutely no restart button. From a moment of her birth, a girl's life path is pretty much locked in, rigidly defined by societal expectation and religious doctrine. Marry young, bear as many children as possible, and hope some survive. Serve your husband unquestioningly, and eventually die tired, worn out, and largely unremembered. Education? Not likely, unless you're from an exceptionally wealthy noble family and perhaps sent to a convent for a very specific, controlled type of learning. For most, your intellectual development effectively stops around the time you learn how to churn butter, mend a tunic, and avoid an unwanted beating. Marriage happens early, really disturbingly early. It's not considered weird or unusual to be betrothed at age 12 and pregnant by 14 or 15. This isn't about romantic love or personal choice. It's about land, livestock, strategic alliances between families, and the continuation of the patrilineal line. Your opinion on the matter? Not required, not solicited, and certainly not valued. Once married, you are, for all intents and purposes, your husband's property, to be managed and disciplined as he sees fit. Your primary job is to produce heirs, preferably male, feed everyone in the household, keep the hovel from collapsing entirely, and, most importantly, not complain. Because complaining, or showing too much spirit or intelligence, might get you branded a nag, a shrew, or worse, a witch. And that particular label often comes with a complimentary public drowning or a festive burning at the stake, depending on local fashion and the current level of community hysteria. Childbirth itself is a terrifying death lottery. There's no prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia, no obstetricians. Midwives, often older women from the village with traditional knowledge, do their best with herbs and experience. But even minor complications can swiftly mean death for the mother, the child, or quite often both. Some women might endure and survive 10 or more pregnancies. Many more do not survive even 2 or 3. But don't worry, once the baby is out, assuming you both live, your workload only increases. Now you have a screaming, vulnerable infant in a lice-ridden, drafty hut, and you're still expected to nurse, cook, clean, and somehow find the energy to help in the fields during planting and harvest. You don't get a break. You're the break for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're viewed with suspicion. If you're widowed, you become incredibly vulnerable, a target for exploitation or unwanted attention. If you're outspoken, assertive, or simply too intelligent for your own good, you're considered dangerous. Women who didn't conform to the narrow, prescribed roles were often the first to be accused of witchcraft, especially if they possess some herbal knowledge, a strong, independent personality, or just happen to look at someone funny on a rainy Tuesday. Even within the church, the supposed sanctuary of the soul, your role is severely limited. Nuns lived under incredibly strict rules. No speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual worth was always ranked below that of even the lowliest male cleric. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, you are expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer, preferably in silence, and ideally, while maintaining a pleasant, subservient smile. Because even in a time of nearly universal suffering, women were somehow expected to suffer more gracefully, more quietly. So far, in our whirlwind tour of medieval misery, you've battled filth, starvation, crushing social injustice, and possibly a rather aggressive goat in your own living space. But just when you think your day, or indeed your entire existence, can't possibly get any worse, here comes violence. Loud, bloody, and often completely, terrifyingly acceptable by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were not a peaceful, idyllic time, regardless of what some romanticized tales might suggest. The idea of law and order mostly meant hope the local lord isn't in a particularly bad mood today and decides to make an example of someone. Violence is everywhere, in the home, in the streets, on the battlefield, which could be surprisingly close to home, in church disputes over theological niceties, and sometimes even in line at the communal bread oven if someone felt cheated. Crime is commonplace, because when people are desperate and starving, laws become suggestions. Punishment, when it is meted out, is brutal, public, and designed as much for terrifying deterrence as for justice. And justice itself is often more of a gruesome performance art than any sort of genuine protection for the innocent. Steal a loaf of bread to feed your children? You could lose a hand publicly and painfully. Accused of lying or spreading gossip, your tongue might be pierced with a hot iron. Gossip too much, especially if you're a woman? Meet the scold's bridle, a heavy, cruel metal mask strapped to your head, often with an iron bar or plate forced into your mouth to prevent speech. For correction, of course. Let's say you're accused of something more serious. Heresy, theft on a larger scale, witchcraft. How do you prove your innocence? Why, by being tortured, obviously, or by undergoing a trial by ordeal. Welcome to the medieval justice system, where logic takes a long holiday. In one popular version, you stick your hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. If your scalded hand heals cleanly, without infection, within 3 days, a near impossibility in such unhygienic conditions, you're declared innocent by God's will. If not, which is almost always the case, you're guilty and will be punished accordingly. Another charming option, you're bound and tossed into a river. If you sink and drown, congratulations. You're innocent and also very dead. If you float, which the human body tends to do, you're clearly guilty, having been rejected by the pure water, and will be pulled out and punished anyway, usually by execution. It's like a medieval game show where the grand prize is mere survival, and the host is actively, sadistically rooting against you. And if you're sentenced to death, that's not a quiet, private affair. Oh no, executions are major public events, performed in front of jeering, cheering crowds. Hangings, beheadings, burnings at the stake, being drawn and quartered. All are considered prime entertainment. Sometimes people bring snacks, make a day of it. It's the medieval equivalent of primetime cable TV, only with more screaming and significantly less CGI. Domestic violence? Completely normal, even sanctioned. Husbands were not only allowed, but often expected to discipline their wives and children with physical force. Street fights and brawls? Commonplace. You could be savagely beaten or even killed just for looking the wrong way at a nobleman's horse, or for accidentally bumping into an armed soldier. And war? War is always simmering somewhere. Local feuds between lords, larger territorial disputes, religiously motivated crusades to distant, unknown lands. Someone is always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or sometimes just sheer unadulterated boredom. Violence isn't a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages. In many ways, it is society. Everyone lives with the constant, gnawing knowledge that life is fragile, justice is arbitrary, and your neighbor might quite happily bash your head in over a disputed pig or a misplaced insult. So, walk carefully, keep your eyes down, and never, ever trust anyone with a large club and a belligerent expression. At this point, if you've made it through the lice, the leeches, the laundry-less misery, the constant hunger, and the looming threat of public disembowelment, you deserve a medal. But now comes the final, inevitable chapter of most medieval lives, an early, unglamorous, and often painful death. If you're alive and still breathing, even wheezing, past the age of 40, you're practically a local celebrity. You might even be reverently referred to as the Old One, which is less of an affectionate nickname and more of a stark statistical miracle. Let's break down the grim numbers. The average life expectancy in many parts of medieval Europe hovers somewhere around 30 to 40 years. But that already bleak number is heavily dragged down by an appallingly high rate of infant and child mortality. Nearly half of all children born would die before reaching the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, one particularly bad winter, a simple infection. That was all it took. There were no vaccines to prevent devastating illnesses, no antibiotics to fight off infections, and often very little real hope once a child fell seriously ill. If you somehow survived the perilous gauntlet of childhood, you entered adulthood already weary, likely undernourished, and carrying the physical and mental scars of a harsh upbringing. Work, as we've seen, began as soon as you could walk upright and contribute. And by the time you reached 25, your joints probably creaked like the ancient door of a monastery. You might be missing several teeth, perhaps a finger or two from an accident, and almost certainly most of your original, youthful optimism. Women, as we've discussed, faced a particularly deadly recurring event: childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. No effective pain relief, no significant medical intervention beyond folk remedies and prayer, just someone holding your hand, perhaps, while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot in a dark, smoky hut. For men, the dangers were different, but equally relentless. Farming accidents were common. A slip of an axe, being gored by an ox. Infections from even minor wounds could fester and kill. A drunken brawl with a neighbor, a call to arms by your lord for some pointless skirmish, or a disastrous decision to join a crusade that went horribly sideways. All could lead to a swift and brutal end. Even a simple journey to the market could be risky if you crossed paths with a bored, opportunistic bandit or an overly zealous, angry tax collector. Death could also come quietly, insidiously, from the plague, which periodically swept across Europe, turning bustling cities into silent cemeteries overnight. Or it could come slowly, agonizingly, from famine, which could grip entire regions for seasons, thinning out whole villages until only the desperate or the dead remain. Or it could come from sheer bad luck, like eating spoiled grain contaminated with ergot, and spending your final, terrifying hours hallucinating, convulsing, and screaming at unseen horrors on the walls of your hovel. And funerals? If you were poor, you were lucky if you got one that involved more than being unceremoniously dumped into a common, unmarked pit. Bodies were often buried quickly, with minimal ceremony, to avoid the spread of disease. There was no embalming for the common folk, no polished coffins, no elaborate tombstones. Just a hastily dug hole, perhaps a few murmured prayers if a priest was available and willing, and a shallow mound of earth, if there was enough space left in the overcrowded churchyard. So yes, in medieval times, life was, for the vast majority, brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death in all its casual, varied, and inventive forms. You didn't retire gracefully. You just stopped showing up one day, your absence barely noted before someone else stepped in to fill your place. And speaking of exits, let's move on to your final chapter, or rather, the end of this particular grim imagining. The medieval dream, if ever there was one, certainly dies hard. So, how's your imaginary day been? You've woken up in filth. You've relieved yourself into a bucket that then joined the communal street river. You've brushed your teeth with wishful thinking and a prayer. You've nearly passed out from hunger before breakfast. You've worked until your spine cried for mercy. You've scratched your way through layers of itchy, unwashed wool. You've prayed fervently not to get the plague or offend God, and you've barely dodged a public execution force, eh? Owning a squirrel that looked suspiciously, Well fed. Welcome, my friend, to a single, fairly typical day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a valiant knight or a graceful lady in a towering castle. Perhaps think again. That romanticized Hollywood version of the Middle Ages. The one filled with gallant swordsmen on noble steeds, ethereal ladies in flowing gowns looking out from ivy-covered towers, heroic battles fought for honor and glory, and endless feasts in candlelit great halls. It's largely a myth, a fairy tale polished to a high sheen by centuries of fantasy books, movies, and wishful thinking. In truth, the medieval world was gritty, it was cruel, it was often terrifyingly unfair, and it was almost universally uncomfortable. Hierarchy was everything. If you were born poor, you almost certainly stayed poor and died poor. If you were born rich, congratulations. You had a marginally better chance of surviving childhood and perhaps not starving to death. But even then, you were still just one bad batch of soup away from dysentery and a hasty, undignified burial. Even the nobles, the supposed elite, weren't immune to misery. Their grand castles were often drafty, stone refrigerators filled with fleas, smoke from poorly drawing chimneys, and politically motivated, loveless marriages. Sure, you might have had a fur-lined cloak and a goblet of wine, but you also had a roughly 50% chance of dying in a pointless skirmish over a patch of land, or from an infected splinter from your own grand oaken table. Not exactly the lap of luxury we imagine. The so-called simpler times weren't simple at all. They were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything hurt more. Everything, from childbirth to chewing a piece of tough bread, came with potential, often dire, consequences. Life was, for most, a constant struggle for survival, not a leisurely pursuit of happiness or self-fulfillment. And if you did find a quiet moment, a rare pause in the daily grind, to think, to dream, to imagine something better, there wasn't much you could actually do with those thoughts. There was virtually no upward social mobility. There was no modern medicine to cure your ills or ease your pain. There was no internet to Google, "What's this weird, oozing rash on my leg?" You lived, you suffered, you worked, and you likely died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born, your horizons as limited as your lifespan. But here's the wildest, most astonishing part. Through all of this unimaginable hardship, through the filth and the famine and the fear, people still laughed. They still sang songs. They told stories around flickering fires. They fell in love, fiercely and desperately. They found meaning in their faith, in their families, in their communities. Not because life was easy, but because humans, it seems, are a stubbornly resilient, astonishingly adaptable species. Even in the darkest, most brutal chapters of our history, they made space for light, for hope, for connection. So tonight, when you slip into your clean, comfortable bed, in a home with indoor plumbing, with access to antibiotics if you need them, and with the simple luxury of central heating or cooling, maybe, just maybe, say a quiet thank you. A thank you to the bewildering, complex, often messy progress of the modern world. And a quiet thank you to your distant ancestors who fought rats, famine, feudalism, and 1,000 other daily horrors, so that you, centuries later, wouldn't have to. Story 2. Catherine the Great. The Middle Ages, with their profound darkness and almost unimaginable harshness, eventually, painstakingly, began to reseed into the annals of history, making way for new awakenings, new empires, and new figures to stride across the world stage. Humanity, however battered, however oppressed, has always found a way to strive, to reach for something more, for knowledge, for power, for change. And in another corner of Europe, centuries after the grim period we've just explored, a young woman, an outsider from a minor German principality, began her own improbable journey. A journey that would not only change her own destiny, but would shake a vast and powerful empire to its very foundations. From the confines of an arranged marriage and a foreign court, could a legend be forged? Could one woman's intellect and ambition reshape the map of the world? Our story now turns from the collective struggle of an age to the singular, astonishing tale of a woman who would become an empress. Let us now journey to the glittering, treacherous courts of 18th century Russia and meet the young princess who would one day be known to all as Catherine the Great. Long before the world knew her as Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, a formidable mistress of reform, and an enduring icon of unyielding ambition, she was simply Sophie. Born Sophie Friedrich August von Anhalt-Zerbst in the year 1729, she hailed from a relatively obscure German princely family. Her tiny, provincial duchy nestled in Pomerania offered little in the way of significant power or influence on the grand European stage. But Sophie herself? She possessed something no inherited title could ever bestow. A razor-sharp intelligence that missed nothing. A relentless, adaptable charm that could disarm even the most cynical courtier, and a quiet, burning hunger for something far greater than her modest beginning suggested. This was not a girl destined for obscurity. Her upbringing was strict, often emotionally barren. Her mother, Johanna, was a cold, calculating woman, less a warm, nurturing figure and more a relentless social climber, obsessed with status and advantageous connections. Sophie's father, a Prussian military officer, was more distant than disciplinary, a shadow in her formative years. From a very young age, little Sophie learned the delicate, precarious art of walking the fine line between outward obedience and inner cunning. She devoured books voraciously, her mind a fertile ground for ideas. She learned to speak multiple languages, not just as an academic exercise, but as a tool. And crucially, she learned how to observe a room, to read the currents of power and personality, before ever uttering a word. Skills that would soon become essential survival tools in one of Europe's most opulent, yet brutally unforgiving, royal courts. The summons came when the reigning Russian empress, Elizabeth Petrovna, began her meticulous search for a suitable wife for her heir, the Grand Duke Peter. Elizabeth, a woman of shrewd political instincts, looked beyond Russia's borders. Peter himself was of German descent, and Empress Elizabeth astutely believed that a foreign bride, pliable, grateful for the elevation, and without a power base of her own within Russia, would be far easier to control. Sophie, with her noble blood, her Lutheran faith, which it was understood, she would be compelled to abandon, and a carefully cultivated reputation for both grace and quiet humility fit the bill perfectly. At the tender, almost fragile age of just 14, Sophie was summoned to the vast, intimidating Russian Empire. She arrived in the freezing, windswept capital of St. Petersburg in the harsh winter of 1744, clad in thin German fabrics entirely unsuited to the Russian frost, wearing a polite, diplomatic smile that masked a universe of anxieties and burgeoning ambitions. Her mother, Johanna, ever the strategist, pushed her forward like a carefully chosen chess piece in a high-stakes game. Sophie, however, already had her own game in mind, her own silent plans unfolding. To become acceptable, to truly embed herself in Russian society, she knew she had to do more than just learn the customs. She underwent a profound transformation, converting to Russian Orthodoxy and taking the new name Ekaterina, or Catherine Alexeyevna. The ceremony was a grand public spectacle, deeply symbolic, and for Catherine, utterly life-altering. She wasn't just changing her religion. She was, in a very real sense, burning the bridge behind her, stepping irrevocably into a foreign, formidable empire with no easy way back to the life she had known. No one watching that quiet, observant teenage girl, wrapped in a fur-trimmed coat against the Russian cold, could possibly have predicted the tempests and triumphs that lay ahead. Betrayal, revolution, the dazzling light of the Enlightenment, and the forging of an empire. But from the very moment Sophie, now Catherine, stepped foot in the Russian court, she ceased to be a mere pawn. She began, with quiet determination, to plan precisely how she would, one day, become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was intended to secure her place within the glittering echelons of Russian royalty, a stepping stone to power and influence. But from its very inception, the union felt more like a gilded cage than a royal crown. Peter, the heir to the immense Russian throne, was far from the dashing, intelligent prince of fairy tales. He was awkward, deeply immature, and alarmingly obsessed with his toy soldiers, spending far more time arranging them in mock battles in his chambers than he ever did considering the governance of an empire, or, for that matter, showing any genuine affection or interest in his young wife. Some historical accounts even suggest he refused to consummate the marriage for years, a source of great anxiety and humiliation for Catherine. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's traditional adversary, and openly resented the Russian court that had adopted him, a court he often treated with disdain. In stark, telling contrast, Catherine embraced Russia with a fierce, almost desperate determination. She threw herself into learning the complex, beautiful Russian language, studying its rich, turbulent history, and meticulously memorizing the intricate rituals of the Orthodox Church. She wanted to belong, to be seen not as a foreigner, but as a true Russian. Peter, on the other hand, seemed only to want to escape. This profound mismatch wasn't just emotional, it was dangerously political. The Russian court of Empress Elizabeth was a viper's nest, a labyrinth of whispered gossip, thick paranoia, and brutal, ever-shifting power games. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with absolute, unquestioned authority, but her health was visibly in decline. Everyone knew a transition of power was looming on the horizon, and everyone, it seemed, had an agenda, a hidden loyalty, a knife poised in the shadows. Catherine found herself under constant, suffocating scrutiny. Her letters were intercepted and read, her friendships monitored with suspicion, her every move analyzed and dissected for hidden meanings. She quickly learned she couldn't fully trust her erratic husband, nor her own mother, Johanna, who was still attempting to whisper in her ear, often on behalf of foreign interests. Even her servants could be spies. In this treacherous world, alliances could morph into accusations overnight, and a misspoken word could mean ruin. But Catherine, even in her youth, was no fool. She learned to play the court's intricate, dangerous games with a quiet, steely resolve, patiently cultivating allies in the shadows. She charmed influential military officers, an invaluable asset. She made friends with scholars and intellectuals, expanding her mind even as she navigated the political minefield. She developed a reputation for dignity, intelligence, and remarkable restraint, a stark and favorable contrast to her husband's childish tantrums, his public drunkenness, and his open, often offensive, contempt for cherished Russian traditions. Behind the closed doors of her apartments, away from the prying eyes of the court, Catherine began a secret, transformative education. She devoured the works of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu, their ideas on reason, governance, and human rights resonating deeply within her. While others at court saw her merely as a young, somewhat isolated royal consort, she was quietly, painstakingly building a vision, not just for her own survival and advancement, but for Russia itself, a nation of strength, enlightenment, education, and reason. But there was one significant, glaring problem: Grand Duke Peter. The longer he lived, the longer he stood as heir, the longer Catherine remained in a precarious limbo, a powerless wife to a man widely considered unfit, unwilling, and unable to rule. And so, she waited. She observed. She learned. And she planned. She knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the Russian throne wouldn't simply be inherited by someone like her. If she were to ever possess it, it would have to be taken. In the momentous year of 1762, after nearly 2 decades of waiting, watching, and quietly, skillfully maneuvering through the treacherous currents of the Russian court, Catherine saw her moment, and she seized it with a breathtaking precision and audacity that would stun Europe. Empress Elizabeth had finally died, and Catherine's husband, Peter, now Tsar Peter III, was at long last on the throne. But his reign, so long anticipated by him, began to unravel with an almost comical, yet deeply dangerous immediacy. In just a few short, chaotic months, Peter III managed to alienate nearly every powerful faction in the empire. He deeply offended the staunchly conservative Russian Orthodox Church with his proposed reforms and his open admiration for Lutheranism. He insulted the proud nobility, the backbone of the Russian state, with his boorish behavior and his clear preference for his German Holstein companions. He humiliated the powerful imperial army, the very force that kept him in power, by forcing them into Prussian-style uniforms they detested and lavishing praise on Prussia, Russia's longtime and bitter enemy. He abruptly reversed key foreign policies, effectively betraying Russia's allies in the 7 Years' War. He publicly mocked the clergy and talked openly and unwisely about divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress, Elizaveta Vorontsova. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior and his questionable loyalties, turned icily cold. The army, filled with generals and officers who respected and admired Catherine for her intelligence and her embrace of Russian ways, grumbled ominously in their barracks and in the corridors of power. Even ordinary Russians, devoutly religious and fiercely patriotic, began to see Peter as a foreign puppet, a buffoon who mocked their sacred traditions and endangered their nation. Catherine, watching all of this unfold with a keen, calculating eye, knew her time had come. In July of that same year, while Peter was away from the capital at his summer palace of Oranienbaum, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around him, Catherine launched her coup d'etat. It was swift, decisive, and remarkably bloodless. Supported by key military officers, most notably her then-lover Grigory Orlov and his influential brothers, she rode triumphantly through the streets of St. Petersburg, dressed in the striking uniform of an officer of the Preobrazhensky Guard. She was proclaimed Empress Catherine II by adoring troops and quickly won the allegiance of the powerful Imperial Guard regiments, the traditional kingmakers, or in this case, queen-makers, of Russia. Peter, caught completely off guard, isolated, and without any significant allies left to rally to his cause, surrendered within days, his brief and disastrous reign over. He was taken into custody and, shortly thereafter, was found dead under mysterious and highly convenient circumstances at a country estate. Officially, it was reported that he died from a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, and far more plausibly, it was murder likely carried out by allies of Catherine eager to secure her position and eliminate any possibility of his return. Catherine was now empress, not by birth, for she was German, not by direct inheritance in the usual sense, not even by the anointing of her deceased husband. She had taken the throne by sheer will, by astute political maneuvering, by courage, and by breathtaking audacity. It was an unprecedented situation. A foreign-born woman, with no legitimate dynastic claim of her own, had seized the vast Russian throne without a single major battle being fought. But her real challenge, the true test of her mettle, was only just beginning. She had to transform that bold, audacious grab for power into a lasting, legitimate, and effective reign. Would Russia truly accept her as their sovereign? Would the powerful, often fickle, nobility respect her authority? Could she hold this vast, unwieldy empire together without falling victim to the same dark intrigues and sudden betrayals that had ended her husband's rule, and indeed, the rule of so many Russian Tsars before him? Catherine understood, with a clarity born of years of observation in a dangerous court, that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily, just as swiftly. She needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a stateswoman, a visionary. And so began her remarkable transformation, from a careful, calculating conspirator to a reforming, formidable empress. An empress who would redraw the borders of Europe, embrace the revolutionary ideals of the Enlightenment, and forever redefine what it meant to be a woman in supreme power. Once Catherine had the imperial crown firmly upon her head, a crown won through such daring and risk, she could have perhaps rested on her laurels, content with the immense power she now wielded. But she didn't. Catherine had something far bigger, far more ambitious in mind than simply occupying a throne and enjoying the trappings of royalty. She wanted to transform Russia, and not just militarily or politically, though those were certainly part of her grand design. She aimed for an intellectual and cultural renaissance. While her ill-fated husband, Peter, had worshipped Frederick the Great of Prussia and played with his toy soldiers, Catherine idolized a different set of heroes: Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, and the other bold revolutionary thinkers of the European Enlightenment. She believed profoundly in the power of reason, in the necessity of progress, in the transformative potential of education, and, perhaps somewhat paradoxically given her own autocratic rule, in the fundamental role of a monarch as a servant of the people. Catherine didn't just passively read Enlightenment philosophy. She actively engaged with it. She lived it. She sought to implement its ideals, albeit selectively, within the vast and often resistant fabric of Russian society. She corresponded directly and extensively with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him, seeking his counsel, while artfully defending her own autocratic system of governance. She invited Denis Diderot, the chief editor of the groundbreaking encyclopedia, to her court in St. Petersburg, engaging him in lively debate, and even purchased his entire library to support him financially when he fell on hard times, allowing him to retain its use for his lifetime. This was not mere intellectual curiosity. It was a deliberate effort to align herself and Russia with the most progressive intellectual currents of the age. Behind the closed doors of the Winter Palace, she pored over legal texts from across Europe. She debated proposed reforms with her advisors, and she personally crafted policies aimed at modernizing the sprawling, often archaic, Russian Empire. Her early reign was filled with ambitious efforts to codify Russian law, a monumental and long overdue task. She convened the Legislative Commission in 1767, a hugely ambitious project intended to consult representatives from various social classes, though notably not the serfs, and to ultimately rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Catherine's own nakaz, or instruction, to this commission was a remarkable political manifesto in disguise, a document heavily influenced by Enlightenment principles. It spoke eloquently of equality before the law for all free subjects, the inherent dangers and inhumanity of torture, and the profound responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an absolute empress in 18th century Russia, its ideas were nothing short of radical. But the lofty ideals of the Enlightenment, born in the salons of Paris and the universities of Western Europe, had to confront and survive the harsh, unyielding realities of Russia, a vast, predominantly feudal land, deeply conservative in its traditions, and ruled by a powerful nobility who liked their serfs exactly where they were, beneath them, bound to the land, and subject to their absolute will. Catherine, for all her intellectual brilliance, knew this. She was a pragmatist as much as she was an idealist. While she passionately advocated for reform, she moved with caution, with a keen awareness of the political tightrope she was walking. She did abolish some of the more brutal forms of torture. She significantly expanded access to secular education, founding new schools, including institutions for girls and libraries. But, crucially, to maintain the loyalty and support of the nobility upon whom her throne depended, she also reaffirmed and even strengthened their control over their serfs, effectively deepening the institution of serfdom in some areas. This was Catherine's perpetual balancing act, a philosopher queen in her correspondence and public pronouncements, a practical, often ruthless, empress in her daily governance. She walked a tightrope between the shining ideals of the Enlightenment and the gritty, often brutal, political necessities of survival, between the sophisticated intellectual salons of Paris and the vast, tradition-bound, and often resistant realities of Moscow and the Russian countryside. Her vision for Russia was bold, ambitious, and genuinely aimed at improvement, but it was always calculated, always tempered by a shrewd understanding of power and its preservation. In many ways, Catherine wasn't simply trying to make Russia European. She was striving to make Russia modern, but on her own terms, with an iron hand artfully concealed within a velvet glove. Catherine the Great wasn't content with merely reforming Russia from within, with polishing its laws and educating its elite. She possessed an insatiable ambition to expand its borders outward, to make the Russian Empire a dominant force on the world stage, a nation worthy of fear, admiration, and perhaps a touch of envy from its European rivals. Where Peter the Great, her illustrious predecessor, had famously opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the very walls, to project Russian power far and wide. Under her astute and often aggressive leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before, a testament to her strategic vision and her willingness to wage war. She waged these wars not just to defend her crown or secure her frontiers, but to actively reshape the map of Europe and Asia. One of her most significant and protracted series of campaigns was against the declining Ottoman Empire, Russia's traditional southern adversary. These Russo-Turkish wars, fought in waves primarily throughout the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about acquiring territory. They were about achieving strategic dominance, securing access to vital warm water ports on the Black Sea, and projecting Russian influence into the Balkans and the Caucasus. Catherine skillfully portrayed herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim Ottoman rule, and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe, a narrative that resonated both at home and among certain European powers. Under brilliant and often ruthless generals like Alexander Suvorov and her influential favorite, Grigory Potemkin, Russian armies achieved stunning victories. They captured key regions, including the Crimean Peninsula, a long-coveted prize, the entire northern coast of the Black Sea, and with it, the crucial access to warm water ports that Russian Tsars had dreamed of for generations. These victories weren't just military triumphs. They were profoundly symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent an unmistakable message to the world. Russia was no longer the distant, backward, somewhat peripheral cousin of Europe. It was a continental superpower, a force to be reckoned with. She also turned her astute, calculating gaze westward. In a series of complex diplomatic maneuvers, alliances, and outright annexations, Catherine participated decisively in the partitions of Poland. The once powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, weakened by internal strife and external pressures, became a target for its ambitious neighbors. Catherine, alongside Austria and Prussia, systematically carved up its territories. By the end of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland, as an independent state, was effectively erased from the map of Europe, and Russia had claimed vast new lands in what is now Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, bringing millions of new subjects, not all of them willing, under her imperial rule. But Catherine didn't just conquer with armies. She also sought to consolidate and develop her expanding empire with ideas and settlers. New cities like Odessa and Sevastopol were founded and rapidly developed along the Black Sea coast. Trade routes were expanded and secured. German and other European settlers were invited to cultivate the fertile but often underpopulated farmlands of southern Russia and the Volga region, bringing new agricultural techniques and a demographic boost. The empire under her rule became a vast, complex mosaic, stretching from the icy shores of the Baltic Sea in the north to the sun-drenched coasts of the Black Sea in the south, from the plains of Poland in the west to the vast wilderness of Siberia in the east. And through all of this whirlwind of military campaigns, diplomatic intrigues, and imperial administration, Catherine remained the central, driving force. She avidly read intelligence reports, she personally issued orders to her generals and governors, and she meticulously oversaw the grand, overarching shape of her expanding empire. Critics, both then and now, would accuse her of being insatiably power-hungry, even ruthlessly imperialistic. But to Catherine, this relentless expansion wasn't mere ambition. It was, in her view, Russia's destiny and her duty as its ruler. A great ruler, she firmly believed, was measured not just by the brilliance of their ideas or the justice of their laws, but by the extent and security of their borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it to elevate it as a civilized, powerful, and enlightened empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and above all, unswervingly loyal to her alone. For all her formidable brilliance as a stateswoman, her strategic acumen in war and diplomacy, and her genuine efforts towards enlightenment and reform, Catherine the Great was, perhaps, just as famous, or in some circles, infamous, for what went on behind the grand, imposing palace doors. And no, not all of it involved poring over state papers or corresponding with French philosophers in the hushed silence of libraries. Catherine's private life, particularly her relationships with a succession of male favorites, became one of the most talked about and often scandalously misrepresented aspects of her long and eventful reign. She had lovers, not just one or two discreet dalliances, but a carefully curated and often publicly acknowledged parade of them. Many were significantly younger than her, almost invariably handsome, and sometimes, though not always, politically influential. She didn't particularly try to hide them. In fact, she often showered them with titles, vast estates, generous pensions, and positions of power, provided they behaved well and remained loyal. If not, if they displeased her or their usefulness waned, they were usually quietly, though sometimes firmly, dismissed, often with a polite, if somewhat cool, thank you and perhaps a comfortable sinecure in a distant province. Among the most important, and certainly the most intellectually and politically significant of these lovers was Grigory Potemkin. He was a man as brilliant, as bold, and as complex as Catherine herself. Their relationship was a unique and powerful fusion, blurring the lines between passionate romance, deep political partnership, and profound intellectual companionship. Some historians even believe they may have married in secret, though definitive proof remains elusive. Together, Catherine and Potemkin shaped military campaigns, oversaw vast colonization projects, and masterminded the transformation and development of southern Russia, the newly acquired territories known as Novorossiya. Potemkin wasn't just a lover. He was in many crucial ways her co-ruler, her most trusted advisor, and perhaps the only man who truly understood the scope of her ambitions and the weight of her responsibilities. Still, 18th century Europe, with its rigid social codes and its particular disdain for powerful women who defied convention, couldn't quite look past the perceived scandal of an empress with a succession of male favorites. Gossip swirled like a miasma through the courts of Europe. Vicious satirical pamphlets, often originating from rival powers or disgruntled factions, painted her as lustful, insatiable, even sexually depraved and unhinged. And after her death, these rumors only grew wilder, more grotesque, the most infamous being the completely false and slanderous tale involving her and a horse. A vile fabrication deliberately spread by her enemies to smear her legacy and diminish her accomplishments. But why this intense, almost obsessive focus on her private life? The answer is perhaps quite simple. Catherine was a woman who wielded immense power openly, unapologetically, and with consummate skill. And in a world where female rulers were rare and often expected to be either saintly virgins, dutiful wives, or tragic, manipulated figures, she refused to play any of those prescribed roles. She lived, she loved, and she ruled entirely on her own terms, and that, to many, made her both fascinating and profoundly dangerous. Ironically, while her critics and detractors painted her as immoral or decadent, Catherine herself was deeply philosophical, even pragmatic about love, relationships, and sexuality. She believed that pleasure was a natural, healthy part of life, and that personal relationships, even passionate ones, didn't necessarily have to threaten or undermine public responsibility or effective governance. She possessed a remarkable ability, one that few male rulers of her era managed, to separate emotion from statecraft, personal affection from political judgment. In reality, her liaisons were often strategic as well as personal. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, intelligent, and politically useful. And when they ceased to be any of those things, or when the relationship had run its course, she usually let them go, often with a smile, a generous settlement, and a clear understanding that their time at the pinnacle of favor was over. Catherine's love life, far from weakening her rule, was in many ways an integral part of her complex strategy for power, a unique, and for her time, audacious blend of passion and pragmatism that made her unforgettable, envied, and undeniably feared. For all her charisma, her intellect, and her tight control over the reins of power, Catherine's long reign was not without its profound perils, its moments of acute crisis that threatened to unravel the very fabric of her empire. And in the year 1773, that peril came storming out of the vast, untamed southern steppes in the formidable, bearded figure of a Don Cossack named Emelian Pugachev. He was no ordinary rebel, no mere disgruntled peasant. Pugachev, with a flair for the dramatic and an astute understanding of popular discontent, made an astonishing and audacious claim. He declared himself to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's dead husband, the deposed Tsar. According to his electrifying narrative, he had miraculously survived the coup and the subsequent attempts on his life, and had now returned, like a savior from the wilderness, to reclaim his rightful throne from the German usurper, Catherine. It was, of course, an absurd claim. Peter III was long dead and buried, but to Russia's oppressed, impoverished, and exhausted lower classes, the serfs, the Cossacks, the factory workers, the ethnic minorities, and the old believers persecuted by the state church, the literal truth of Pugachev's claim scarcely mattered. What mattered was the hope he offered, the vision he painted of a world turned upside down. Pugachev promised liberation from the crushing burdens of serfdom. He vowed an end to an oppressive taxation and conscription. He offered land for the common people and a restoration of traditional rights and freedoms, particularly for the fiercely independent Cossack communities. His words, carried on the winds across the Volga River region and the Urals, ignited a firestorm of rebellion. In a time when the chasm between the opulent, privileged nobility and the brutally exploited serfs had widened to an almost unbearable degree, his promises sounded like salvation itself. The Pugachev rebellion rapidly escalated, becoming the largest and most violent peasant uprising in Russian history. Whole towns fell to the rebels. Fortresses were besieged and captured, and nobles, government officials, and priests loyal to Catherine were often brutally slaughtered. For a terrifying, desperate period, it seemed as if the empire itself, that vast, seemingly unshakable edifice Catherine had worked so hard to strengthen and expand, might actually fracture, might crumble from within. Catherine, for all her customary composure, was shaken to the core. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with disciplined cavalry charges and clever treaties. This was a revolt from within, her own people, or at least a significant portion of them, rising up in a frenzy of violence and despair against the very system she ruled, the system that sustained her power. But Catherine, true to her nature, didn't panic. She acted with cold determination. She dispatched professional military forces, under experienced generals, to crush the rebellion ruthlessly and without mercy. The fighting was brutal, the reprisals savage. Pugachev's largely untrained and ill-equipped forces, despite their initial successes and their ferocity, were ultimately no match for the disciplined might of the Imperial Russian Army. The rebellion was decisively defeated in 1774. Pugachev himself was captured, betrayed by some of his own followers. He was transported to Moscow in an iron cage, a public spectacle designed to cow any remaining dissenters, and was eventually, after a summary trial, beheaded and dismembered in a gruesome public execution, a stark, bloody warning to all who might dare to follow his example. Afterward, in the grim aftermath of the rebellion, Catherine doubled down on order and control. Her earlier, more idealistic dreams of perhaps, one day, liberating the serfs, or at least significantly improving their condition, quietly faded into the silence of political expediency. The Pugachev uprising had shown her, in the starkest possible terms, the dangerous limits of Enlightenment ideals in a country still so deeply shackled by feudalism, ignorance, and simmering resentment. She now leaned even harder on the nobility, the very class whose excesses had helped fuel the rebellion, granting them even greater powers and privileges in exchange for their unwavering loyalty and their assistance in maintaining social control. This was a significant turning point in her reign. The empress who once eagerly quoted Voltaire and Diderot on the rights of man now prioritized stability, order, and the security of her throne above all other philosophical considerations. Reform became far more cautious, more incremental. Surveillance of potential dissenters increased. Rebellion, even whispered, was to be stomped out with brutal efficiency before it could ever again draw breath. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a chilling warning, a specter that would haunt Catherine for the remainder of her reign. That power built on profound inequality and oppression could only hold for so long before the storm came crashing through once more. By the time Catherine the Great approached the final, venerable years of her life, she had ruled the vast Russian Empire for over 3 remarkable decades, longer than any previous female ruler in Russian history, and indeed, longer than most of her male predecessors. From that audacious moment she seized power in a palace coup, she had consistently defied expectations, reshaped her empire with a bold and often ruthless hand, and fundamentally redefined what a woman, and indeed a monarch, could achieve. Under Catherine's formidable reign, Russia was irrevocably transformed into a true European superpower, its influence extending far beyond its ever-expanding borders. Its territory grew by an astonishing measure, over 200,000 square miles, swallowing Crimea, vast swathes of Poland, and strategic stretches of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just lines redrawn on a map. They were strategic pivots, securing those long-coveted warm-water ports, opening up new avenues for trade and naval power, and fundamentally altering the geopolitical balance of Europe. But her legacy wasn't solely etched in military victories and territorial acquisitions. Catherine left an indelible cultural mark as well. She was instrumental in founding the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, which began with her personal art collection and would grow to become one of the greatest and most renowned art institutions in the world. She amassed one of the finest collections of Western European art in Europe, a testament to her sophisticated taste and her desire to bring European culture to Russia. She corresponded with, and often patronized, some of the greatest minds of the Enlightenment, turning her court, for a time, into a vibrant center of intellectual discourse, sophistication, and artistic ambition. In a country often viewed by Western Europeans as backward, even barbaric, Catherine decisively put Russia firmly on the cultural and intellectual map of Europe. She championed the modernization of education, founding schools for girls like the Smolny Institute, a radical concept for its time, and promoted the printing and dissemination of books, even trying her own hand at writing plays and memoirs. She bravely introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, a cutting-edge medical practice at the time, even publicly receiving the vaccine herself and having her son inoculated, an act of scientific courage and public leadership that undoubtedly saved countless lives. Yet, her reign was also, undeniably, one of profound contradictions. While she genuinely admired and eloquently espoused Enlightenment ideals of liberty and reason, she never freed the serfs. In fact, under her rule, serfdom was extended deeper into Russia's newly acquired territories, and the legal power of nobles over their serfs was in some ways strengthened, not diminished. Her reforms, while often impressive and far-reaching, remained mostly top-down, designed to polish the facade of the empire, to make it more efficient and powerful, without truly transforming its deeply feudal and autocratic foundations. Still, Catherine's rule brought a period of relative stability, immense ambition, and a new sense of national pride to Russia. She understood, perhaps better than any of her contemporaries, that power was not merely inherited. It was crafted, it was managed, it was constantly defended, and it had to be wielded with intelligence and authority. She ruled not by divine right alone, but by sheer force of will, by her exceptional political brilliance, and by a relentless, often ruthless, calculation. She was called many things in her lifetime and by history: a usurper, a tyrant, a reformer, a patron of the arts, a seductress. But above all, she was undeniably effective. When she died in 1796, at the age of 67, Russia was wealthier, larger, more culturally vibrant, and militarily more formidable than it had been at any previous point in its long history. She left behind a throne that was secure, an empire dramatically expanded, and a legend, complex, contested, but undeniably grand, that would endure for centuries. Catherine didn't just reign. She ruled, with intellect, with strategy, and with an unapologetic, unwavering grip on the levers of history. And in doing so, she became more than just an empress. She became a myth. For all her immense power, her territorial expansion, and her enduring historical legacy, Catherine the Great was still, at her core, a woman navigating and often defiantly reshaping a world overwhelmingly dominated by men. Behind the imperial portraits, the grand state decrees, and the carefully constructed image of an enlightened autocrat was a person deeply, perhaps painfully, aware of how precarious her position truly was and how much she had to strive to maintain it. She was not born Russian. She was a German princess in a foreign land. She came to the throne not by legitimate succession, but through a daring coup d'etat. She ruled a vast, conservative empire that was often deeply resistant to change and inherently suspicious of female authority. And yet, she not only endured, she thrived, she dominated, she left an indelible mark. Catherine was never content to be merely ornamental, a figurehead empress. She read constantly, an insatiable appetite for knowledge that fueled her reforms and her correspondence. She wrote endlessly, letters, plays, memoirs, legal instructions, her mind always active, always questioning, always learning. Her daily schedule was notoriously intense, packed with hours of reading state reports, corresponding with foreign ambassadors and rulers, editing government papers, and skillfully managing a court filled with rival factions, ambitious nobles, and ever-present intrigue. She wasn't content to simply sit on the throne. She worked the throne with the diligence and acumen of a stateswoman born to it, though she was not. She was also, in many ways, profoundly lonely. She surrounded herself with courtiers, advisors, lovers, and artists, yet she wrote in her private memoirs of how few people she could truly, unreservedly trust. Her relationship with her son and heir, Paul, whom she deeply distrusted and deliberately kept away from state matters, was fraught with tension and disappointment. She feared he would undo all her painstaking progress, a fear that proved not entirely unfounded after her death. Her greatest emotional and intellectual partnership with Grigory Potemkin eventually faded from passionate love into deep, abiding friendship, but his death in 1791 left a void, a wound in her life that never truly healed. Catherine meticulously crafted her public image with the skill of a master propagandist. She understood the immense power of narrative, of perception, and she wielded it more effectively than most monarchs of her age or any age. She posed for portraits as the loving mother of Russia, the wise and enlightened monarch, the valiant warrior empress leading her troops, even if only symbolically, and the discerning, sophisticated lover of the arts. But beneath these carefully constructed roles, these imperial masks, was a woman who had endured rejection in her youth, betrayal in her marriage, scandal in her personal life, and rebellion against her rule, and had not only survived, but had kept going, kept building, kept striving. When she died in November 1796, she left behind an empire transformed, but also a legacy filled with complex questions that historians still debate. Could she, or should she, have done more to end the scourge of serfdom? Were her genuine Enlightenment ideals ultimately compromised by the harsh realities of Russian politics and the need to maintain power? Was she, in the final analysis, more of a reformer or more of an absolute ruler? More an enlightener or more an imperialist? History remembers her by the title she never officially gave herself, but which posterity bestowed upon her, the Great. It wasn't because she was flawless or universally kind or always just. It was because she took power against all odds and wielded it with extraordinary skill, intelligence, and unwavering determination on her own terms, in a time and a place where women were rarely supposed to have any power at all, let alone wield it so effectively. She didn't just wear the crown, she fundamentally rewrote what it meant to deserve one. Story 3. The Mystery of the Red Queen of Palenque. From the gilded, ice-bound halls of Imperial Russia, where power was wielded with a very visible, often iron, hand, our journey now takes us much further back in time, and to a vastly different, more enigmatic world. We leave behind the sweeping snows and the ambitious Enlightenment salons, and venture deep into the humid, emerald embrace of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico. Here, shrouded by the relentless, patient growth of centuries, lie the haunting ruins of a civilization that rose to astonishing heights and then mysteriously faded, long before Catherine the Great even drew her first breath. This was a world where kings and queens communed with gods in elaborate rituals, where time itself was not a simple line but a sacred, repeating cycle, and where magnificent stone pyramids, like man-made mountains, pierced the dense jungle canopy, guarding secrets that lay dormant, untouched for 1,000 silent years. Let us now delve into the very heart of this ancient Maya world, to the magnificent, enigmatic city of Palenque, and uncover the story of a queen whose power was rediscovered not in grand, surviving decrees, but in the silent, astonishing tomb of crimson and jade. In the humid, almost breathless depths of this Chiapas jungle, the ruins of Palenque, or La Cama, as the Mayan knew it, meaning big water, still whisper their ancient stories to those who will listen. Towering temples, their limestone faces weathered and stained by time, humidity, and the encroaching jungle, rise with a kind of ghostly grandeur above the verdant canopy. Their intricate carvings, though eroded, still hint at a world brimming with complex mythology, sophisticated astronomy, and profound spiritual understanding. In the year 1994, one of Palenque's most profound and intimate secrets was finally ready to reveal itself. A dedicated team of Mexican archaeologists, led by the astute Fanny Lopez Jimenez, was meticulously surveying Temple 13. This structure, a relatively modest pyramid, stands in the shadow of, and directly adjacent to, the more famous and imposing temple of the inscriptions, the magnificent funerary monument of Palenque's mightiest and most celebrated ruler, Kinich Jana Pakal, known to history as Pakal the Great. Temple 13 itself wasn't initially expected to hold any major revelations. It was smaller, less adorned, until, that is, the archaeologists noticed something odd, something easily overlooked. A small, almost hidden, sealed chamber, concealed deep beneath the temple structure, a space that no looters, ancient or modern, had ever managed to touch. It was pristine, a silent capsule of time. With a mixture of trepidation and mounting excitement, the archaeologists carefully broke through the ancient seal. As they lowered themselves into the darkness of the newly opened chamber, the air that greeted them was heavy, thick with the undisturbed weight of countless centuries. There, resting in a profound, unbroken silence, lay a massive stone sarcophagus. As they painstakingly, reverently, lifted the heavy lid, a cloud of brilliant, shocking red dust rose like a plume of crimson smoke, catching the light of their lamps. The entire interior of the sarcophagus, and everything within it, was covered in this vibrant, powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide, but also a substance deeply sacred and ceremonially significant to the ancient Maya. And lying within that ethereal, crimson cloud was the delicate, fragile skeleton of a woman. She had clearly been buried with immense care, with profound reverence. Her bones, though ancient, were remarkably intact. Her skull still wore the serene, otherworldly gaze of a meticulously crafted jade mask, its green stones cool and luminous against the pervasive red. Her body was surrounded, adorned, with a breathtaking array of funerary offerings. Intricate necklaces, elaborate diadems, heavy ear spools, all exquisitely crafted from precious jade, shimmering shell, and gleaming obsidian. Everything about this burial, from the richness of the offerings to the sanctity of the location, screamed royalty, screamed immense importance. Yet, astonishingly, no name was inscribed anywhere on the sarcophagus. No identifying glyphs on the chamber walls offered a clue to her identity. It was one of the richest, most significant female burials ever discovered in Mesoamerica, and yet it was a complete, tantalizing enigma. Why was she buried in this vibrant red powder, a substance both sacred and dangerous? Who was this powerful, anonymous woman? Was she a queen, a high priestess, perhaps even Pakel's revered wife, sharing a sacred precinct in death as she might have in life? The researchers, in awe and some degree of frustration, called her La Reina Roja, the Red Queen, and the name, evocative and mysterious, stuck. Even with the advanced tools of modern forensics, including DNA analysis, they couldn't immediately say for certain who she was, only that she had lived and died around the 7th century AD, during the absolute golden age of Palenque, when the city was at the zenith of its power and cultural influence. Unlike most other Maya tombs, which had often been looted or disturbed over the centuries, hers had been deliberately hidden, left untouched, purposefully isolated, as if guarding a particularly potent secret. Her burial wasn't just ceremonial, it felt deeply spiritual, almost alchemical. This woman, it seemed, wasn't meant to be remembered through inscribed words or royal titles. She was meant to be remembered, to be revered, through ritual, through sacred color, and through the profound, enduring mystery she left behind. The most haunting, most visually arresting feature of the Red Queen's tomb wasn't her exquisite jade jewelry, nor the echoing silence of the perfectly sealed chamber. It was the red dust. A thick, pervasive layer of finely powdered cinnabar covered everything. The massive stone sarcophagus, the chamber walls, her very bones, even the precious offerings carefully arranged around her. It clung like dried blood to ancient stone, a vibrant, almost shocking declaration against the darkness. To the ancient Maya, this was no mere decorative flourish. It was a ritual of profound spiritual significance. Cinnabar, derived from crushed mercury sulfide, ore, was one of the most sacred and also one of the most dangerous substances in the ancient Mesoamerican world. Its brilliant, enduring red color wasn't just visually striking, it was deeply symbolic. It represented blood, the very essence of life. It symbolized rebirth, the dawn, the east, and the life force that connected the human realm with the divine. Red was sacred. It was the color of sunrise, the color of sacrifice, the color of life emerging, phoenix-like from the embrace of death. And this use of cinnabar wasn't just symbolic. It was believed to be spiritually transformative. Covering the dead, especially the elite dead, in cinnabar was a ritual act intended to transform the body, perhaps to preserve it not for a literal eternity in the physical sense, but for its crucial transition into the next world, into a deified state. In Maya belief, death wasn't a final end. It was a passage, a perilous but necessary crossing into another cosmic layer, the underworld known as Xibalba. And so the Red Queen, whoever she may have been, was being meticulously prepared not just for burial, but for a form of deification, a journey into the sacred. But there's another, more practical, and perhaps more unsettling layer to the use of cinnabar. It is highly toxic. Mercury sulfide, when handled or inhaled, can lead to severe mercury poisoning, causing tremors, hallucinations, and even death. The Maya likely didn't understand the precise chemistry involved, but they undoubtedly felt its potency, its volatile, powerful, almost otherworldly nature. To bathe a revered corpse in such a substance was to declare, in the most potent way possible, that this person was no ordinary mortal. This was someone touched by the sacred, destined for the divine. In the grand city of Palenque, very few individuals were afforded a burial with such an intense, all-encompassing use of cinnabar. The great king, Pacal himself, whose magnificent pyramid tomb dominates the sacred precinct, was one. His body, like hers, was also found saturated in the same vibrant red powder. That detail alone, the shared ritual use of this rare and potent substance, immediately drew intense speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or perhaps someone of equally high, near-divine status, a spiritual counterpart in this sacred royal lineage? Her skull, it was noted, had been carefully placed upon a layer of jaguar skin, another potent symbol of royalty, power, and the underworld in Maya cosmology. Around her lay an array of bone needles, perhaps used for ritual bloodletting or textile work, sharp obsidian blades for sacrifice or other sacred acts, and miniature jade figurines, all hinting at complex rituals performed either during her life or in her honor at the time of her death. Every single element of her burial, meticulously arranged, told a silent story, a story without written words, but rich in cultural meaning. A story of power cloaked in profound secrecy. A woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence and shadow, but in high ceremony, drenched in the sacred, life-giving, and transformative color of sacrifice and rebirth. Surrounding the Red Queen's crimson-drenched remains, within that silent, stone-sealed chamber, was a world of carefully chosen treasures, their coolness a stark contrast to the fiery red dust. Their gleam, the deep green of jade, the iridescent shimmer of shell, the dark volcanic glass of obsidian, broke the ancient silence. These were not mere ornaments, not simply displays of wealth. They were sacred offerings, each one meticulously selected to accompany her on her arduous, perilous journey to the Maya afterlife, the shadowy, complex realm known as Xibalba. At her sides, heavy and cool against where her flesh once was, lay magnificent jade necklaces, their polished, hand-carved surfaces still radiant, still pulsing with an inner light after more than 1,300 years entombed in darkness. Jade, to the Maya, was not just beautiful. It was the most sacred of substances, more precious than gold. It was a symbol of eternal life, of fertility, of power. It represented the vibrant green of young maize, the life-giving vitality of the jungle, the very breath of the gods and the waters of creation. Only the highest elite, the royalty, and the most powerful priests were buried with such an abundance of jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, adorned her wrists, and graced her ears in the form of heavy, elaborate ear spools. A clear, unambiguous sign that in life she wielded significant influence, perhaps even a measure of divine favor. One of the most haunting and personal objects found was the jade funerary mask, placed delicately, reverently, over her face. Unlike the solid gold death masks of ancient Egypt, this one was a subtle, intricate mosaic constructed from dozens, perhaps hundreds of tiny, perfectly fitted jade tiles, carefully arranged to mimic the idealized contours of her skull, to give her an eternal, serene countenance. This mask served a crucial ritual function, to protect the soul on its journey, to preserve her identity in the afterlife, and to present her as a divine, or at least divinely touched, being in the eyes of the gods and the denizens of Xibalba. Scattered near her bones were other significant items. Long, slender bone needles, perhaps used in life for weaving intricate textiles or in ritual bloodletting ceremonies. Sharp, black obsidian blades, tools of sacrifice, of power, of cutting through the veil between worlds. And delicate shell artifacts, perhaps representing the watery underworld or used as containers for sacred substances. One small bone pin was found to be faintly engraved, a tiny, almost lost echo of her voice, a whisper from a time beyond memory. At her feet and along the edges of the sarcophagus were ceramic vessels, still sealed after all these centuries, likely once filled with offerings of food, drink like maize beer or sacred chocolate, or perhaps fragrant copal incense, all intended to sustain her spirit on its long journey beyond the confines of mortal death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a challenging, layered journey, filled with trials, tests, and encounters with formidable gods of death. These items, therefore, weren't luxuries. They were spiritual necessities, a sacred toolkit for the soul. To modernize, the contents of the tomb feel intimate, not overloaded with ostentatious wealth, but rather intentionally curated, each object imbued with profound spiritual weight. There was no gold in the Mesoamerican sense of old world treasure, no chariots, no grand displays of material pomp. Just items chosen with deep spiritual meaning, a map for the soul's passage. Through these carefully selected treasures, we glimpse how the ancient Maya understood death, not as a finality, an ending, but as a crucial transition of power, a transformation of being. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten, to simply molder into dust. She was being meticulously prepared to ascend, to transform, to continue her existence on another sacred plane. For all the undeniable grandeur of her tomb, for all the precious offerings that surrounded her, the Red Queen left behind one profound, haunting void. No name, no identifying inscriptions adorned her magnificent sarcophagus. No intricate glyphs on the chamber walls declared her lineage, her titles, her accomplishments. She was clearly someone of immense power, of sacred importance. But who precisely was she? From the moment her tomb was unsealed, scholars, archaeologists, and epigraphers began the painstaking work of trying to connect the dots, to weave together the tantalizing clues. The most compelling and widely accepted theory is that the Red Queen was Lady Tiziac-Buajau, the wife, the queen consort of Palenque's most famous and powerful ruler, Kinish Jina Pakal the Great. Tiziac-Buajau was far more than just Pakal's spouse. She was born into a noble, perhaps even royal, lineage herself, and married into Palenque's ruling dynasty at a young age, likely as part of strategic alliance. She bore Pakal at least 3 sons, all of whom would go on to hold high status and play significant roles in Palenque's history, 2 of them even succeeding their father as rulers. Historical inscriptions from Palenque, though not found directly in her tomb, suggest she played a key ceremonial and political role during her husband's long and illustrious reign. If anyone in Palenque, aside from Pakal himself, was deserving of such an elaborate and honored burial, it was likely her. Supporting this theory is the tomb's very location. It was discovered in Temple 13, directly adjacent to and architecturally aligned with Pakal's own grand funerary monument, the Temple of the Inscriptions. This close proximity, in a city where temple placement was deeply symbolic and cosmologically significant, strongly suggests a deliberate, meaningful pairing, perhaps husband and wife, co-rulers in a spiritual sense, united in death as they may have been in life. And then, of course, there's the dramatic use of cinnabar. Only 2 burials in all of Palenque have been found with such an intense, all-encompassing saturation of the sacred red powder, Pakal the Great and the Red Queen. It seems highly improbable that this profound ritual similarity, this shared crimson embrace, was mere coincidence. But here, the mystery deepens, as it so often does in archaeology. DNA tests were conducted on the remains of both the Red Queen and Pakal in the hope of confirming a direct familial connection. The results, however, were inconclusive, or at least not straightforward. The mitochondrial DNA analysis showed no direct maternal link between the Red Queen and Pakal's known descendants, which would rule her out as his mother. However, this didn't definitively rule out a spousal relationship, as marriage, of course, does not require a shared maternal bloodline. Some scholars have argued that she could perhaps have been Lady Sac-Cook, Pakal's powerful mother, who herself ruled Palenque as queen regent before her son came of age. Others have suggested she might have been a high priestess of immense spiritual authority, or perhaps a royal sister or another significant female ancestor whose name and story have simply been lost to the erosion of time and the silence of the stones. Still, the cumulative weight of the evidence, the tomb's location, the richness of the burial, the shared use of cinnabar, and the historical context of powerful royal women in Palenque points most strongly towards Tizekbu Ajah, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to the great Pakal. The intriguing lack of a name inscribed in her tomb may not have been an oversight, an accident of preservation. It may, perhaps, have been intentional. In the complex cosmology of the Maya, the soul, the essence of a being, lived on not merely through monumental inscriptions, but through ongoing ritual, through potent symbols, and through the enduring whispers of the sacred earth itself. And so the Red Queen remains, suspended alluringly between legend and historical truth, a woman who undoubtedly wielded power, remembered not in stone-carved words, but in sacred scarlet and in eternal, enigmatic silence. To truly understand the significance of the Red Queen, we must also understand the world from which she came, a world where Maya women, especially those of royal blood, often held far more influence, power, and spiritual authority than many later historical accounts, colored by colonial perspectives, might have led us to believe. In the intricate tapestry of Maya civilization, politics, religion, and family were inextricably intertwined. Royal women were not merely passive consorts, confined to the domestic sphere. They were often active diplomats, forging crucial alliances through strategic marriages. They were powerful priestesses, conducting sacred rituals that ensured the favor of the gods and the cyclical renewal of the cosmos. They were, in many cases, vital power brokers, their bloodlines a form of political and spiritual capital, used to legitimize claims to the throne and secure dynastic continuity. Consider, for example, the aforementioned Lady Sak Kuk, the mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne of Palenque was left vacant or contested, she herself took power and ruled as queen regent, guiding the city-state with a firm hand until her son was old enough to assume his royal duties. She wasn't a mere placeholder. Inscriptions show her depicted as a ruler in her own right, issuing decrees, overseeing construction projects, and performing sacred ceremonies. Without her strength and legitimacy, Pakal himself might never have risen to become the legendary king he was. And she wasn't an isolated anomaly. Across the vast Maya world, in powerful city-states like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, inscriptions and carved stone monuments, known as stele, clearly depict women performing major dynastic and religious ceremonies, participating in warfare and diplomacy, and sometimes ruling outright as queens regnant. They were often portrayed in these monuments adorned in elaborate headdresses and royal regalia, standing beside kings as equals, or sometimes even in positions of superior prominence. Their words were carved in intricate glyphs, their names and deeds remembered, at least until the jungle or later conquerors began to reclaim their stories. By the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, centuries after the classic Maya collapse in many regions, much of this rich memory of female power had eroded or been deliberately suppressed. The colonial lens often saw indigenous women primarily as silent, subservient figures in a male-dominated world. But the archaeology, the slowly deciphered glyphs, and the careful re-examination of existing evidence increasingly tell a different, more complex, and far more fascinating story. One of intricate gender roles, where power was negotiated, shared, and sometimes fiercely contested, not simply inherited along purely patrilineal lines. This broader context casts the Red Queen, this anonymous yet clearly revered woman of Palenque, in a new, more powerful light. She may not have ruled directly in her own name, as far as we currently know, but her extraordinarily rich and sacred burial, her positioning beside the paramount king, Pakal, all strongly suggest she was a central, indispensable pillar in the royal order, a figure of immense spiritual and dynastic importance. Her jade mask wasn't just a beautiful decoration. It was a symbol of her enduring identity, of power held in life and protected, transformed in death. Her bloodline, her role as a royal wife and mother, may have been the very glue that held Palenque's dynasty together during a crucial period of its history. In Maya civilization, a queen, especially one like Tiziac-Buajah, wasn't just a queen. She was a keeper of sacred lineage, a vital voice in ceremony, a conduit between the human and divine realms, and often the essential bridge between gods and men. The Red Queen of Palenque may be nameless to us now, but in her own world, she was undoubtedly never voiceless, never powerless. The Red Queen wasn't just buried with treasures. She was buried in an architectural statement, a structure rich with purpose, layered with the intricate cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design so characteristic of the ancient Maya. Her tomb wasn't merely a grave, a final resting place for mortal remains. It was conceived as a sacred gateway, a carefully constructed portal to eternity, a place of transformation. Her body was discovered, as we know, deep inside Temple 13, one of the somewhat smaller, less outwardly ostentatious pyramids within the sacred heart of Palenque. Yet its deliberate, precise proximity to the monumental temple of the inscriptions, the final resting place of Pakel the Great, is profoundly telling. These temples, these sacred mountains of stone, weren't built randomly, placed haphazardly. Their positioning, their alignment, their very architecture were guided by sophisticated astronomical observations, by deep-rooted myths of creation and cosmic order, and by the dynastic legacy they were meant to embody and project. Temple 13 rises modestly compared to its grand, imposing neighbor, but it hides something even more intimate, more potent. That perfectly sealed crypt, untouched by looters, miraculously preserved through the centuries. It was constructed deep within the temple's solid core, accessible only by a steep, narrow, almost hidden staircase that descended into the earth, a ritual journey downward, perhaps into the embrace of the underworld, Xibalba. The burial chamber itself is stark, almost austere, constructed of carefully cut and fitted stone blocks, sealed tightly against the outside world for over 1,300 years. No vibrant murals, as seen in some other Maya tombs, cover its walls. No ornate, narrative carvings tell her life story in explicit detail. But perhaps this very silence, this lack of overt inscription, is intentional. This was a space designed not for the living to interpret with words, but for the dead to transform, to undergo a sacred metamorphosis. At the very center of this potent, silent space, her massive limestone sarcophagus sits like an altar, a focal point of immense spiritual energy. It echoes in its grandeur and its careful craftsmanship, the even grander stone coffin of Pakel found next door. While Pakel's famous sarcophagus lid is famously engraved with complex scenes depicting his fall into the jaws of the earth monster, his journey through the underworld, and his ultimate rebirth as a maze god, a cosmic scene of death and glorious resurrection. The Red Queen's tomb is more subdued, more inward-focused in its symbolism. The primary focus here seems to be on the body itself, on the transformative power of the sacred cinnabar, on the very ritual of death and transfiguration. And yet, there are subtle architectural cues, alignments, that hint at deeper meanings. The tomb, like many sacred Maya structures, is aligned with cosmological principles, perhaps east to west, mirroring the sun's daily journey from life through darkness to rebirth, a symbolic path for the soul. The chamber is small, but it feels incredibly powerful, potent. It feels deliberate, personal, a sacred, protected enclosure designed for someone deeply revered, someone whose spiritual essence was considered vital to the continued well-being of the city and its royal lineage. Maya temples were not just buildings. They were cosmological tools, powerful instruments designed as bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, to be buried within one, especially in such a sacred and central location, was to be elevated beyond the merely human realm to be intrinsically linked to the sacred order of the cosmos. The Red Queen's eternal home wasn't an afterthought, a simple grave. It was a carefully constructed shrine, a meticulously planned sacred space, a place where death itself became transformation, where the mortal became divine. Her bones rest in stone, her essence is preserved in sacred cinnabar, and her enduring legacy is whispered by the very architecture of the temple itself. A temple that speaks volumes without uttering a single inscribed word, telling us, across the centuries, that she mattered profoundly. To the ancient Maya, as we've touched upon, death wasn't the end. It was a threshold, a sacred, often perilous, passage into the complex underworld known as Xibalba. And for someone of the Red Queen's evident stature, this crossing was not only a spiritual journey. It was a political statement, a cosmological event, and a deeply ritualized process essential for the continuation of cosmic order and dynastic legitimacy. Burial rituals for the Maya elite were carefully choreographed, intensely symbolic events, rooted in ancient myths and meticulously designed to guide the soul of the deceased through the treacherous, layered labyrinth of the underworld. Maya's sacred texts, like the Popol Vuh and intricate iconography found on pottery and stone monuments, tell us that Xibalba was no peaceful, idyllic afterlife. It was a shadowy realm filled with challenges, rivers of blood and pus, houses of darkness, cold, and jaguars, and formidable, often malevolent, gods of death who had to be outwitted or appeased. Only those who were properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped with the necessary offerings and knowledge could hope to navigate this perilous journey successfully and perhaps achieve a form of rebirth or deification. The Red Queen, as we've seen, was buried wrapped in sacred cinnabar, encased in a massive stone sarcophagus, and surrounded by precious offerings, all clear signs of an elite, royal burial, designed to ensure her safe passage and elevate her status in the afterlife. But there's more. The presence of those slender bone needles and sharp obsidian blades in her tomb, as mentioned earlier, hint at the importance of auto-sacrifice rituals, the sacred act of bloodletting, in her life or in her funerary rites. These could have been symbolic tools, representing rites she had performed as a priestess or royal woman to nourish the gods and maintain cosmic balance. Or they might have been used in reenactments at her burial to empower her spirit for its journey. Her funerary mask, so carefully assembled from countless tiles of precious green jade, was not simply a decorative or protective item. It may have served as a spiritual vessel, a way to preserve her divine or royal countenance, her very identity, as she journeyed into the often disorienting realm of the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was a mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized to maintain its integrity, to be properly greeted by the gods and ancestors in the other world. The ceramic vessel surrounding her, once filled with sustaining offerings of food, drink, or sacred incense, would have nourished her ka, or soul spirit, in the next world. Other items, perhaps stingray spines, another common tool for bloodletting, or shell trumpets, could have represented potent spiritual tools, instruments for calling to the gods, or tokens of ritual communication and power. Burial, for the Maya, wasn't just a final goodbye. It was a profound act of transformation, a cyclical process. They believed in cycles of death and rebirth, much like the agricultural cycle of maize. Death as the planting of a seed, burial as the nurturing earth, and the afterlife as the hopeful sprouting of new life, a glorious rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as earthly incarnations or conduits of powerful deities, and in death, they were believed to return to those divine origins, perhaps to join the pantheon of sacred ancestors who continued to watch over and influence the living. The Red Queen, covered in the vibrant, life-giving color of blood and rebirth, entombed within a sacred pyramid mountain and honored with offerings fit for a goddess, was being meticulously prepared for such a rebirth, not as a mere mortal, but as a being intrinsically tied to the sacred, eternal order of the cosmos. Her burial wasn't the end of her story. In the Maya worldview, it was the powerful, ritualized beginning of her legend, her journey into divinity. Just a few steps away, a mere stone's throw from the Red Queen's final, silent resting place in Temple 13, lies one of the most iconic and extensively studied tombs in all of Mesoamerica, that of Kinish Pakal, Pakal the Great. His magnificent burial, discovered deep within the grand temple of the inscriptions, is celebrated worldwide for its breathtaking artistry, its monumental scale, and its profoundly complex spiritual symbolism, most famously depicted on his intricately carved sarcophagus lid. But what makes the discovery of the Red Queen's tomb so extraordinary, so compelling, is not only what was found inside it, but precisely where it was found. Her sarcophagus, as we know, was hidden within Temple 13, directly adjacent to, and in careful architectural relationship with, Pakal's own imposing monument. In a sacred city like Palenque, where every temple, every plaza, every alignment was meticulously planned to reflect cosmic principles and dynastic narratives, this profound closeness, this deliberate juxtaposition, was no accident. It was an intentional statement, a powerful narrative etched in stone and sacred space. Many scholars, as we've discussed, believe the Red Queen was indeed Lady Tizakbu Ajah, Pakal's queen and trusted consort. While her tomb, unlike Pakal's, lacks identifying inscriptions, the striking similarities between their burials are too profound to ignore. Both were wrapped in that sacred, vibrant cinnabar. Both were entombed within pyramid structures that served as both temples and funerary monuments. Both were buried with an abundance of precious jade, the most sacred material to the Maya, and both were clearly treated with extreme reverence, their burials designed as elaborate rituals of transformation and deification. These rituals, these sacred preparations, seem to mirror each other, as if they represent two halves of a single, unified sacred narrative, a dynastic and cosmological statement. Pakal's famous sarcophagus lid vividly depicts him at the moment of death, falling into the maw of the underworld, yet simultaneously poised for rebirth, associated with the world tree, a cosmic axis connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, a powerful scene of death, transformation, and ultimate resurrection. The Red Queen's simpler, uninscribed tomb contains no such overt, grand iconographic display. But the symbolism, perhaps, lies in the powerful pairing itself, in their eternal proximity. If Pakal, in his tomb, represented the sun, the masculine principle, journeying through the darkness of the underworld each night only to be gloriously reborn at dawn, then the Red Queen, entombed beside him, may have represented the moon, the sacred feminine force, following her own mysterious, cyclical path in the heavens, a powerful counterpart in this cosmic dance. Together, in their adjacent tombs, they may have embodied a fundamental cosmic duality, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, divine order and sacred ritual. In Maya mythology, and indeed in their societal structure, rulership and cosmic balance were often not singular, but relational, dyadic. Harmony in the cosmos, and thus harmony in the kingdom, required this sacred balance. And that balance, it seems, extended from the living court into the realm of the royal dead. By placing the Red Queen in such honored proximity to Pakal, the ancient Maya were preserving not just a marriage, if indeed she was his wife, but a vital cosmic partnership, a sacred union intended to endure beyond death and ensure the continued prosperity of Palenque. Their closeness in death may have mirrored their essential roles in life. A queen not merely behind, but powerfully beside her king, sharing not just a throne, but a profound spiritual destiny, a shared and lasting legacy. In their silent, crimson-dusted tombs, they continue to speak to us without words, two powerful souls, wrapped in cinnabar and sacred stone, eternally joined across the vast expanse of time. One of history's most sacred and most eloquent silences. Though her name was lost to the direct historical record found within her tomb, the Red Queen of Palenque endures, not as a forgotten relic of a vanished world, but as one of the most enigmatic, compelling, and spiritually resonant female figures of the ancient Americas. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, undisturbed by time or human hands, now whispers its secrets across the centuries, inviting questions that echo louder, more insistently, with every new discovery, every fresh interpretation. She represents a profound mystery that still resists full, definitive understanding, a tantalizing glimpse into the inner life of a powerful Maya royal woman. We may never know with absolute, unshakable certainty exactly who she was. No carved glyph on her sarcophagus proclaimed her name. No painted stela in her chamber recounted her lineage or her deeds. And yet, the palpable care in her burial, the extraordinary richness of her offerings, the profound symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones, and the sacredness of her tomb's location, all speak with an undeniable eloquence of a woman who was profoundly important, not merely as a wife or a royal consort, but as someone who likely held real spiritual influence, dynastic weight, and perhaps a measure of her own sacred royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to reevaluate our assumptions, to look beyond the often male-dominated narratives of ancient history. She stands as a powerful, silent reminder that in the complex, sophisticated world of the ancient Maya, women were not merely silent, passive figures. They led rituals, they influenced politics, they governed cities, they bore and raised kings, and they shaped the destinies of their dynasties. While great kings like Pakal have long, and justifiably, taken the historical spotlight, the reemergence of the Red Queen from her long slumber reminds us, with vibrant force, that power, influence, and sacred authority did not belong to men alone. It flowed through mothers, through queens, through priestesses, through visionary women whose stories are slowly, painstakingly, being reclaimed from the dust and the jungle. Her legacy is more than just the precious treasure she left behind, more than the scientific data gleaned from her ancient bones. It's the ongoing conversation she has started, the debates she has fueled among archaeologists, historians, epigraphers, artists, and storytellers around the world. Every jade bead, every layer of sacred cinnabar, every carefully considered architectural choice in Temple 13 tells us something deliberate, something meaningful. This woman mattered. Her life, her death, her spiritual journey were of paramount importance to her people. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of her enduring story. Not what we definitively know, but what we still don't, what we are still striving to understand. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just a static collection of facts, a settled and finished narrative. It's a living puzzle, an ongoing dialogue, a shared human longing to connect with, to understand, and to learn from the past. In that sense, her legacy is still actively unfolding, still revealing new facets with each passing year of research and reflection. She lies wrapped in sacred red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth, a silent sentinel of a lost world. Her face, once hidden behind a serene jade mask, now stares back at us through the lenses of science, through the interpretations of art, and through the enduring power of human wonder. She may remain, in one sense, nameless, but she is far from voiceless. She is mysterious, but she is no longer forgotten. The Red Queen of Palenque may have ruled a kingdom in her mortal life, but in her enigmatic death, she rules something perhaps even greater, our enduring imagination, our unceasing quest to understand the depths of human history and spirit. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. And still, somehow, across the abyss of centuries, she speaks. And so, our passage through these varied tapestries of time, our exploration of lives both epic and intimately drawn, for now, draws to a close. We have journeyed far together, haven't we? From the grim, unyielding realities of medieval life, where survival itself was a daily, brutal art form. We've walked the corridors of power in Imperial Russia, witnessing the calculated ambition and transformative reign of Catherine the Great. We have peered with a sense of awe and enduring mystery into the silent, crimson-dusted tomb of an ancient Maya queen, feeling the profound weight of centuries and the whispers of civilization lost yet not entirely forgotten. What a vast expanse of human experience we have touched upon tonight. From the collective, often anonymous, struggle for mere survival in a harsh and unforgiving world, to the solitary, powerful assertion of individual will against seemingly impossible odds. From a silent power etched in ancient stone and sacred offerings, to the vibrant, bleeding declarations painted on canvas for all the world to see and feel. If there's a thread, a common human echo that weaves through these disparate lives, these vastly different eras, perhaps it is the extraordinary, stubborn resilience of the human spirit. Its remarkable capacity to endure unimaginable hardship, to create beauty in the face of desolation, to love fiercely amidst chaos, to fight for meaning and identity, and ultimately, to leave a mark, however faint or bold, however celebrated or misunderstood, upon the vast, ever-unfurling scroll of history. These stories, plucked like precious, sometimes painful, gems from the endless river of time, serve to remind us that behind every date, every grand event, every ancient artifact, there are human hearts that once beat with passion, with fear, with hope, and with an unyielding desire to live, to connect, to mean something. May these echoes of the past linger with you, not as settled facts or closed chapters, but as open invitations. Invitations to explore further, to question more deeply, and to always listen with an open heart and a curious mind for the whispers of those who came before us, for their stories, in countless, often unseen ways, continue to shape our present and illuminate our shared human journey. Thank you for joining me on this voyage through time. Until we meet again, may your curiosity continue to be your guide, lighting the way as you explore the infinite stories that history still holds in its embrace.